I'll actually do that on the recording that this workshop is being recorded. Uh, Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Uh, this is a modeling advisory group workshop on the draft 2025 inputs and assumptions for the 2024-2026 integrated resource planning cycle. I'm Jared Ferguson. I'm the supervisor for the integrated resource planning and modeling team. And for the next almost 4 hours, we'll be going through the updated inputs and assumptions. But first, do a little housekeeping. Next slide. Next slide, please. So the workshop slides that you're going to see today have been posted. Were posted about a week ago to the IRP 2024-2026 IRP cycle webpage linked there. Also posted to that webpage was the 2025 draft inputs and assumptions document that these slides are going over. As I noted at the start, this workshop is being recorded, and the recording of the workshop will be posted to that same webpage. The purpose of this workshop is multifold. We're going to be providing an overview of the 2025 inputs and assumptions that is going to be used over this IRP planning cycle. And we're going to be focusing in on a few specific topics that are new or are being updated in the assumptions compared to the last cycle. And the goal of this is to provide basically this overview and to get stakeholders familiarized with these updates as in draft form, so we can work on finalizing the INA document for use in the rest of the cycle. We will be asking for informal stakeholder feedback that staff will consider in reviewing and incorporating into the final inputs and assumption document, and just noting that it's informal and will not be on the record of the proceeding. Next slide. So as is pretty standard in our IRP workshops, we will be doing questions through the Q&A feature of WebEx throughout the presentation. This is if you are on the computer application, there's the 3 horizontal dots, the ellipses, that provides additional options. And if you click on that, there is a Q&A button, and that will pop up the Q&A box in which you can ask your questions, and panelists will be able to answer them throughout the workshop. Additionally, staff will be posting a complete written log of all the Q&As to the webpage following this workshop. I'll note that we aren't going to be using the chat feature, which is there. It's much easier and a easier process and easier for staff to track and answer questions using the Q&A feature. So please do not use the chat feature. If there is time and if people are unable to use that Q&A feature, we will at certain intervals allow verbal clarifying questions. So if you're on the WebEx app, there is the raise hand button, and then the host will unmute you, and then you can lower your hand. And if you're on a phone, you would dial *3 to raise your hand. Again, you will hear a prompt once you've been selected. But again, I encourage you to have the input your questions into the Q&A feature of WebEx. Next slide. So this slide and then this subsequent slide is a very detailed agenda of what we'll be covering in the next, like I said, 3.5 hours. We'll have staff from Energy Division as well as Energy Division consultants walking through array of an array of topic points that we want to focus on for these inputs assumptions. And you can see here it's broken down by sort of main topic area. Next slide. And then next slide. So to provide some sort of context and background to this inputs and assumptions workshop, we have I'll get to continue talking here and provide sort of where we are in the IRP planning cycle and where this inputs and assumptions document and materials fits within that. Next slide. So this 2025 draft inputs and assumptions material describes the key data, assumptions, and methodologies that the CPUC IRP team will use in its analysis and modeling within this 2024-2026 IRP cycle. The draft document that's being workshopped today will be finalized over the next few months and is expected to be used to develop the 2026 preferred system plan for this cycle, as well as 2 TPP portfolios. So for the next 2026-2027 TPP and the subsequent 2027-2028 TPP. As I noted earlier, the document and all the supporting materials is on our 2024-2026 IRP cycle webpage. Next slide. I'll also want to acknowledge that we are definitely aware and are tracking the number of potentially significant policy changes that are currently occurring at the federal level that could have impacts on these inputs and assumptions that are posed in this deck, and potential even for further impacts to IRP modeling this cycle. Staff are continuing to monitoring these developments, and as they materialize and become more firm, we will continue to assess whether updating these inputs and assumptions will be necessary or not. We'll also, throughout this cycle, consider modeling sensitivity scenarios to help us better understand what are the potential impacts of those potential policy changes, if that is necessary to help us develop portfolios throughout this cycle. We'll note though, these are a lot of these policy changes are still, potential policy changes, so we're not incorporating them into the inputs and assumptions as presented here yet. And we find it necessary for this cycle that we keep this process moving forward with this INA draft material and basically confirm a single set of those inputs and assumptions that we'll use for our upcoming filing requirements next quarter. Next slide, please. So more detailed breakdown of that agenda of what's going to be covered today. So you've been, we'll have first introduction to the that provides an overview of the 2 models that are used in IRP, the resolve capacity expansion model, and then the Servum production cost model, as well as the key data and model updates to them. The next section is going to be the load forecast. So this is our assumptions and sources used to derive the forecast of loads in the ISO and the broader WEC, including the impacts of demand side programs and such as load modifiers and electrification. Next section is on the baseline resources. So the resources that are assumed to be existing or in development and will be operational in the year model that are served as the basis on which our resolve model would select additional resources on top of them. Section 4 is the cost assumptions used for the various candidate resources in resolve. Next slide. Section 5, the optimized resources. This goes into detail on the assumptions used to characterize the new resources that can be selected by the resolve model in its least cost optimization. Section 6 is our operating assumptions for generators. It's used to characterize our hourly electricity demand, how each of the resources in Resolve are going to operate on an hourly basis. Section 7 is details the resource adequacy requirements. So looking at the constraints imposed on the Resolve portfolio to ensure both system and local reliability are met, and how the various resources that Resolve can select can contribute to meeting those requirements. And then the last section, section 8, focuses on the greenhouse gas emissions and clean energy policy, the accounting and assumptions used to characterize those constraints that are assessing how the portfolios developed meet our greenhouse gas and renewable energy policy targets. Next slide. And so in this specific workshop today, we have definitely far too much material in the INA to cover in the 3 hours. So we're going to be focusing on 2 sets of topics. First, our updates to the inputs and assumptions with basically a newer vintage of the data previously used. So this includes the load forecast assumptions, resource cost updates, resource potential based on the land use constraints, the transmission constraints assumed in the model, as well as fuel prices. And we'll also be introducing or discussing the new items that we're considering including in the modeling effort for this cycle of IRP, which includes the Resolve, basically an update to the Resolve zonal topology to split the ISO zone into the 3 PG&E, SCE, SDG&E zones, the inclusion of enhanced geothermal and various long duration energy storage as default candidate resources that Resolve can select. Additionally, we're going to be talking about specific updates and improvements that we particularly want to seek stakeholder input on. This includes the thermal retention and repower costs and options that we're proposing to include, as well as for geothermal resources, the ambient temperature derates. And finally, another example of this is our intraday, our modeling of intraday sharing for the long duration energy storage. Next slide, please. And where this inputs and assumptions workshop fits into the broader IRP planning cycle right now is, so as I mentioned, we released these slides and the draft INA document last week. We're having the workshop right now, today. We're seeking stakeholders' informal comments by March 7th. And then, as I mentioned, we're hoping to produce the final updated INA document for this cycle in the May to June timeframe of this year. Next slide, please. So for those informal comments, we would appreciate informal comments. We've given stakeholders 2 weeks from when we released the material last Thursday to provide that comment. So again, that was March 7th. We're asking for those comments by, and we're asking to please submit your comments to the email included here. And we're also encouraging stakeholders to share their comments with the IRP service list when you do submit them. To just help us better review and analyze your comments, we're asking you to categorize your comments based on the various sections that are laid out in the draft 2025 INA document. And we particularly appreciate as much data, specific data and citations with your comments when you're providing them. Next slide. And with that, I think we can dive into the meat or the details of this INA, and I believe I'm turning it over to Angana from E3 to brief you all on the updated zonal topology.
Thanks, Jared. Yes, Jared mentioned this section is gonna start with updates that we made to the zonal topology. We can go to the next slide. So CAISO is our main zone in result model, but this round we are disaggregating this zone into 3 zones for Pacific Gas and Electric, Balancing Authority, as well as Southern California Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric. We will have individual zones, and the aggregation and collection of these 3 zones will represent the CAISO. In result modeling, the CAISO zone is our main zone where we make new build decision as well as the dispatch decisions. In addition to CAISO zone, we also model, similar to in the past, 5 balancing areas, 5 other neighboring zones, which we call those external zones. And these external zones are mainly represented with their regarding their dispatch optimization decision, as well as their dynamics with interzonal power flow decisions. We do represent these zones with their load, their respective existing resources, as well as with the forecasted load and future build that we foreseen into these neighboring zones. The list of these neighboring zones is included in this table, as well as the list of balancing authorities that each zone is representing. The IID, LADWP, and CNC Northwest and Southwest are those 5 external zones that we represent. Can we go to the next slide, please? With disaggregating the CAISO zone into 3 zones, the PG&E, SC, and SDG&E, it gives some capability or new functionality into Resolve. We are able to better align with the servum topology, as well as we are able to capture that interzonal transmission constraint between the PG&E, SC, and SDG&E zones, which will help to optimize or find locations with regards with these constraints as well. In addition to that, it will also help to make decisions around non-retention decisions for gas fleet as well. And collectively, because of the impact on optimization, it will make the busbar mapping work also easier down the road. With this disaggregation, we also allow the model to evaluate new build decision if it finds optimal to expand transmission deliverability and constrain the power flow between the IOU zones, or namely PG&E, SC, and SDG&E zones. Can we go to the next slide, please? Because of the disaggregation of the zones in CAISO, we also make additional updates to our modeling and representation. For example, baseline resources are going to be represented at each of the CAISO zones. The thermal retention constraints are updating to represent IOU-specific constraints. Annual loads and load profiles are also being updated. Candidate resources potential and profiles are also updated to represent IOU-specific characteristics. The transmission paths are introduced to capture that power flow between PG&E, SC, and SDG&E. I also want to highlight the policies that will be continued to represent at the CAISO level, meaning there are no changes to the way we represent the total reliability need, the greenhouse gas emission target, and clean energy targets. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, I will hand it over to my colleague Joshua to continue.
Thanks, Angana. So for this section, we'll be talking about the baseline and forecasted external zone resources that are an input to the Resolve and servum models. Next slide, please. And starting with our baseline online and in development resources. Next slide, please. Yeah, so to start with some key definitions, as we've mentioned in the past few slides, the baseline resources are an input to both resolve and serve them, and this includes online and development resources for both CAISO and for the external non-CAISO zones. And so we define online units as those that are already built and operating, and this is net of any scheduled retirements based on the model year. And in development units represent more near-term builds in the next few years that are units that already have approved contracts and or are already under construction. And we do want to clarify the baseline does not include candidate resources. So those are additional future builds that are optimized by Resolve and will be discussed in a later section. We construct the baseline from a couple different sources for CAISO. We get our data for online resources from the master generating capability list and also the retirement and mothball list for any units that are going offline. For CAISO in development resources, we get our data from the December 2023 IRP compliance filings, and all baseline non-CAISO resources are sourced from the WEC Anchor dataset. Next slide, please. So here we're going to show an overview of the baseline capacity in CAISO by resource type. So on the graph on the right here, we have the baseline capacity split up into the 3 zones, PG&E, SC&E, and SDG&E to reflect the model update I'm gonna describe. So between these 3 zones, we have approximately 95 gigawatts of resources that represent the CAISO baseline, of which about 13 gigawatts are in development. And the graph on the right shows the baseline capacity in 2028. That year is chosen because that's the year once all these in development resources come online. So together, this adds up to approximately 29 gigawatts of fossil fuel generators, about 13 gigawatts between nuclear, geothermal, biomass, biogas, and hydro, roughly 9 gigawatts of wind, 23 gigawatts of solar, 16 gigawatts of storage of all types, and about 4 gigawatts of demand response. Next slide, please. And likewise, showing this for the external non-CAISO California zone, so IID, LDWP, and NCNC. As we mentioned in 2 slides ago, this data is coming from the WEC Anchor dataset, and these 3 zones together have approximately 19 gigawatts of capacity. Next slide, please. And then we also have our Northwest and Southwest external zones, the Northwest being mostly Washington and Oregon with a little under 50 gigawatts of capacity, and the Southwest primarily representing Arizona and Nevada with about 41 gigawatts of capacity. And we'll note that for all of the past 3 slides, we have a more detailed breakdown of the capacity by resource and by year in the inputs and assumptions report. Next slide, please. So digging in deeper for a couple resources in the baseline, starting with how baseline gas in CAISO is modeled. So in the graph on the right here, we're showing a couple different categories of how the gas is treated in Resolve. We'll start with our combined heat and power units, which are these maroon bars close to the top of the graph. Similar to previous cycles, we assume combined heat and power units are going to phase out on a linear trajectory from 2031 to 2040, and so that's an input that is forced into the model. The remaining gas units in CAISO, so that would be combined cycle or CCGTs, peakers, and reciprocating engines, are going to be subject to Resolve's economic retention decisions. So this is a part of Resolve's optimization, where the model gets to decide how much gas to keep on the system for reliability needs. Resolve's decision is to either retain the gas on the system or to not retain the gas. And in the real world, if the gas was not retained, it would still be free to contract with non-CAISO entities. So this amount of gas is broken into the gray and the blue bars on the graph. The gray bar represents the gas that is still needed to serve local capacity needs. And so we source that data from CAISO's local capacity study, and we And based on that, we assume about 14.5 gigawatts of gas capacity must be retained at all times for this local capacity need. The blue portions of the bars represent the remaining gas capacity that Resolve can choose to economically retain or not retain. That totals about 12.5 gigawatts, and that's split between gas that is not located in local zones or gas that is in local zones but can be replaced with 4-hour batteries according to the CAISO local capacity study. Additionally, that very light blue bar on the top of the SCE portion of the graph represents the 3 once-through cooling steam turbines in the strategic reserve, which are not included in the Resolve and Servo model. Next slide, please. We've also updated our hydro trenches in this IRP to reflect differences in both eligibility for the renewable portfolio standard and differences in how some of these hydro resources dispatch. So we have 2 different delineations. The first dealing with the renewable portfolio standard. We have small hydro units that are under 30 megawatts that do qualify for the RPS, and large hydro units greater than 30 megawatts that do not. And the second delineation has to do with how these hydro resources dispatch. So first we have the run-of-river tranche, and second, non-run-of-river, with the latter representing more of the scheduled reservoir type hydro. So between these two, we end up with 4 different tranches for in CAISO hydro, which are small run-of-river, small non-run-of-river, large run-of-river, and large non-run-of-river. And additionally, we are still modeling the Northwest hydro for CAISO as we have in the past, which represents firm hydro imports from the Northwest, and we base this on historical asset controller import data from the California Air Resources Board. The Northwest hydro for CAISO is modeled very similarly to our large non-run-of-river tranche, with the key difference being the Northwest hydro for CAISO does not contribute to CAISO's resource adequacy, whereas all the other tranches do. Next slide, please. So we just reviewed the online resources and sort of the near-term and development resources for both CAISO and external zones. For future CAISO builds, as Angana mentioned, Resolve optimally selects builds from the candidate resources, which are the next section. But for the external zones, we forecast these future resources, which we'll explain in this section. Next slide, please. So the graph on the right here is a good illustration of why we're forecasting the builds for external zones. Want to highlight that this graph is illustrative. It does not represent a true load and resource balance, but we do see in this example for the Southwest, we see the stacked bars represent the nameplate capacity for the baseline, and the black line represents the peak load forecast over time, and we can see pretty clearly the load is growing very steadily, but the baseline resources are static or declining over time. So eventually there will be a gap to fill with future resource builds. And because we're doing an IRP for CAISO and not the whole WEC, we only have sort of candidate optimized builds in CAISO. But as Angana mentioned, we do want to model the dispatch and the import-export in these zones and between these zones and CAISO. So we do need to come up with a forecast of future builds in these zones, because otherwise CAISO is going to see an unrealistic export opportunity, and we don't want that to happen. We want to see realistic dynamics in these external zones in our model. So we've tried a couple different things to address this in past cycles, and we've decided to formalize the approach we took in the 2023 Preferred System Plan, which is to survey the IRPs of the utilities in these external zones and use them to forecast future resource builds and add those to the model as an input. Next slide, please. So we'll summarize the steps we take for this here. There is a slight difference between utilities or balancing areas that do have IRP reports and those that do not have IRP reports. And in the latter category, that makes up the majority of the small POUs or public utilities in our external zones. Starting on the left, the balancing areas with IRP reports, we collect their load forecast data from their report, so both peak and energy. We collect data for future builds, and that starts in 2024, basically the same starting year as the same cutoff year as our online and in-development resources in the baseline. If the IRP report or this data does not extend out to 2045, which is the last model year in our CPUC IRP, we're going to extrapolate that data. So we'll take the growth rate of the load, extrapolate it out to 2045, and we would also extrapolate the builds out to 2045 from whatever the final year in this utility's IRP is. The fourth step here is that we're going to subtract out any baseline in development resources from these IRP builds, and we do this to avoid double counting sort of these near-term builds that are already in the baseline. And then the resulting portfolio we will add as an input to the model as new builds that are going on top of the baseline. Moving to the right, for these small public utilities that do not have IRP reports, we take a very similar process, but with some changes in each of the steps. Load forecast data for these we derive from FERC Form 714. And to get the composition of the future builds, we are estimating them based on the resource mix from neighboring balancing areas. So for example, if the neighboring utilities build 50% wind in their plan, we will also assume that this balancing area without an IRP will also build 50% wind as sort of an assumption we can ground in the trends happening in that region. In the third step, we're going to take that estimated portfolio and scale it up or down to meet this balancing area's peak load. And the fourth step remains the same, where we subtract out any in-development resources to prevent double counting, and then similarly add this future build portfolio as an input to the model on top of the baseline. Next slide, please. So going to briefly go through some of the results of this process, starting with loads. So we're showing the gross load forecast for the non-CAISO California zones here. For this, the loads are fairly simple to obtain. We get them from the CEC IPER forecast, and we take the managed load from IPER and add in the behind-the-meter solar impact to get the gross load, which is shown in the graph. Next slide, please. And a similar process for the Northwest and Southwest, just using different sources. So for the managed load, we're either using the IRP reports or for utilities that don't have those reports. As we mentioned on 2 slides ago, we use FERC Form 714. And likewise, we're adding in behind-the-meter solar to that managed load to get the gross load, and we source the behind-the-meter solar impact from EAA data similarly to what we've done in the past. Next slide, please. And here we're just going to show a snapshot of what the forecasted future builds look like, showing what they end up at in 2045. So in all of these zones, we have a mix of wind, solar, storage, and firm resources. And for more details on the breakdown by resource zone and year, you all can refer to the inputs and assumptions report. And with that, I will pass it off to Sam to go over our candidate resources for CAISO.
Thank you, Josh. You'd advance to the next slide. So we're now going to switch gears and spend some time talking about the candidate resources represented in the IRP. Move to the next slide, please. So to start things off, we'll give a quick summary of the major updates to candidate resources. Next slide. So new to the 2025 INA, we have a number of updates we're going to present to you today. First, on resource costs, we've updated our assumptions to the latest NREL 2024 ATB, as well as other newer vintages of publicly available data sets. In addition to this new data update, we've also prepared new capital cost assumptions for some key technologies modeled in the IRP, as well as developed new financing costs for all technologies. More on those in a little bit. Next, in tandem with Angana's discussion on the newly disaggregated resolve model, we have updated our resource regions used in the IRP to represent our in-state resources. The approach aligns also with the study areas used in the CAISO transmission planning process. Next, on resource potentials and land use, we performed some updates to reflect the 2024 BLM Western Solar Plan, and also updated our in-state wind potentials using newer capacity factor data from NREL. As well as these two updates, we also have new data to share on enhanced geothermal and pumped hydro resource potentials. Finally, on transmission and interconnection, we've received the latest 2024 CAISO transmission white paper and have incorporated the latest transmission deliverability constraints. And on interconnection, we have new information to share on how we are constraining localized builds of resources to reflect locational interconnection limits. Now, there's a lot of material that we'll cover in this section on a lot of different topics, and we may not get to everything on today's call, so I encourage stakeholders to please refer to the written INA document, as well as provide informal comments on these topics. Next slide, please. So before we begin, I want to give a brief recap on what we mean by candidate resources and optimized resources specifically. So within the IRP, we have two different categories of resources that we model. Optimized resources, which are the main focus of today's presentation, are those that are represented as decision variables in the resolve optimization model. These are the resources that are part of our least cost portfolios. In addition to optimized resources, we also have non-optimized resources. These are also modeled in the IRP, but their adoption is prescribed over time, and consequently, these are not represented as decision variables. Those would include customer PV, behind-the-meter lithium-ion batteries, and energy efficiency. Within optimized resources, we have two subcategories. There are default technologies, and there are non-default technologies. The default technologies primarily include established commercially viable options that include solar, wind, geothermal, and the like. New to the 2025 INA, we propose adding two additional classes of technologies to our default list. These include enhanced geothermal, both near field and deep, and generic long-duration energy storage archetypes at 12, 24, and 100 hours of duration. We'll present more data on those in a little bit. Besides these technologies, we also have non-default technologies. Those are also colloquially known as the emerging technologies. We do not have any new data to share on the emerging technologies today, but we may revisit them ahead of the next preferred system plan. Next slide, please. So we'll begin our discussion on candidate resources with the resource cost updates. Next slide. A quick summary of the updates we'll talk through today. First, we've updated our primary data source for most of our conventional technologies to NREL 2024 ATB and the PNNL Energy Storage Grand Challenge dataset. In addition to this overall vintaging update of our data sources, we have also developed new CapEx assumptions for utility scale solar, onshore wind, and lithium-ion batteries. For these technologies in particular, we have benchmarked our current year CapEx to a wider range of data sources, as well as developed new CapEx trajectories to account for greater variability in potential futures. For all technologies represented in the IRP, we are proposing new market-derived financing assumptions, including cost of debt, cost of equity, and WACC, that we can use to calculate the key cost metrics, namely levelized fixed cost, and levelized cost of electricity. So we'll have a little bit of information on that in a little bit. And finally, we won't get into this in today's call. We have also refreshed our state-specific cost multipliers for CapEx, fixed O&M, and interconnection using the latest labor, site control, and spur line length estimates. Next slide, please. So before we go into any of those updates, another quick note we wanted to share on the treatment of tax credits in IRP modeling. In 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. The legislation allows for investment tax credits and production tax credits for zero carbon technologies developed in the United States. The tax credits, 30% ITC and $27.50 per megawatt hour for the PTC in 2023 dollars, are assumed to last until the later of 2032 and the year in which the US power sector achieves 75% decarbonization over 2022 levels. In the 2023 PSP, and also in the 2025 INA presenting here, we assume that the decarbonization target is achieved in 2045. That is the year that then triggers a 3-year phase out of the tax credits. So when we're reviewing our resource cost forecasts, and if you're reviewing information in the INA document or in the pro forma cost model, you will observe these tails to our cost forecasts in the last 5 years of the horizon, and that corresponds to the phase out assumed for the tax credits. Specifically, we assume that solar and onshore wind receive the PTC, and that comes from earlier analysis where we've demonstrated that the PTC is more cost effective for those technologies than the ITC. For most of our other zero carbon technologies, we assume that those will receive the ITC. And all of these technologies are assumed to receive the bonus IRA rates for meeting certain prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. Echoing Jared's comments from our introduction today, we're aware that there may be some evolving guidance on the treatment of these tax credits in the future, and we'll remain apprised of any updates and incorporate them into our models as needed. Next slide, please. So getting into the key updates we've made for the 2025 INA, I want to begin with the new benchmarking analysis that was performed for our solar, onshore wind, and lithium-ion batteries. The main motivation of this update was to encompass a wider range of data sources into our CapEx estimates. The update has 2 parts. We are first benchmarking our current year CapEx estimation using this wider set of data sources. The results shown here are for the solar, and in the written report, we have the results for wind and lithium-ion batteries as well. The sources include NREL-ATB, the EIA Annual Energy Outlook, Lazard, EPRI, SIA, the DOE, and PNNL. For each technology, our new mid-cost assumption being shown here is taken as the average across these data sources, and we also established low and high sensitivities for use in sensitivity analysis. Next slide, please. In addition to the current year CapEx updates, we have also spent some time developing new CapEx trajectories for these 3 technologies. The motivation here is twofold. First, for our utility scale solar, we reviewed the trajectories from NREL 2024 ATB and observed a discontinuity in the cost learning in 2035. This is what's being shown in the chart on the right. The blue curves represent the real cost projections from ATB, and the red curves represent the implied nominal costs when applying an inflation factor. Because we do not believe that there's any meaning to a discontinuity in our cost learnings in 2035, we're proposing new trajectories for solar that smooth over that discontinuity. For wind and lithium-ion batteries, the new trajectories that we've developed were intended to capture a wider range of potential futures of learning for those technologies. When you review these in the report, you will see that the low and high costs represent a wider range of values than the NREL-ATB trajectories did. Next slide, please. Now, the CapEx adjustments that we just described are only being applied to solar, wind, and batteries. But in addition to those CapEx improvements, we've also developed new market-based financing assumptions that we intend to apply to all technologies represented in the IRP. Specifically, we're proposing that new custom financing assumptions on cost of debt, cost of equity, the debt fraction, and WACC are used to replace NREL-ATB when we conduct our levelization of the resource costs. The motivations for these updates are several. First, by using this market-based data, we can align better with the WACCs that are realized by actual projects being developed today. Next, the data sources that are being leveraged for this work, including the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve, are public, accessible, and authoritative on these subjects. And finally, by making this switch to this new public data, we're able to make more frequent interim updates to our financing costs should the economic realities evolve in the near future. This is an advantage over using NREL-ATB, which only releases a publication once per year. We are using this market data to calculate both current and projected future corporate borrowing rates, project leverages, and cost of equity. The specific approach that we take is we are assigning each technology modeled in the IRP to one of 3 risk classes, those being low risk, middle risk, and high risk, based on the perceived financing risk. Then within each of those risk classes, a separate low, mid, and high WACC forecast is developed to result in 3 new cost scenarios within each risk class. So putting this all together, we've developed 9 new WACC forecasts. Next slide, please. Here are some quick snapshot results from the approach that we've developed. So first on the left, we have our assignment of risk class to some of the key technologies that we consider in the IRP. Our low risk technologies include utility scale solar, gas CT frames and CCGTs, as well as onshore wind. Medium risk technologies include lithium ion batteries, biomass, and geothermal. And our high risk technologies include offshore wind, pumped hydro, those 2 primarily. On the right, we can see the results of the analysis for a low risk technology. Here, the solid black line is the WACC forecast from NREL 2024 ATB for utility scale solar. Based on the new analysis that was conducted, our INA mid assumption for solar WACC trends slightly below NREL-ATB. However, the advantage of our new approach is we now have additional low and high sensitivities on our WACC. This will allow us to capture a wider range of financing costs in our cost projections and have more realistic low and high sensitivities in our analysis going forward. Next slide, please. So putting all of these 3 updates together, the initial year CapEx benchmarking, the CapEx trajectory updates, as well as the new WACC developments, we can compare side by side the cost forecast from NREL-ATB and what's being proposed here for the 2025 INA. On the left, you will see NREL. On the right, you see the 2025 results. Immediately in 2023, by virtue of these updates, we're achieving a greater spread in current year LCOE estimates, and that is more in line with what we expect to see from actual project developments, a greater variability in costs. Next, in 2035, by virtue of our new forecasts, we've removed that discontinuity. And finally, throughout the entire modeling horizon, there's just a greater overall spread in our LCOEs, and this is due to that new WACC low and high spread. Now, as a final note, echoing what was discussed previously, you'll observe there's a tail from 2045 to 2050 that's due to our assumed expiration of the tax credits. NREL 2024 ATB does not assume that those credits will expire before 2050. Next slide, please. I now want to spend a minute talking about the cost updates for offshore wind resources. So harkening back to last year's AB 1373 need determination analysis, we presented as part of that analysis 5 distinct cost scenarios for offshore wind. The scenarios included the low, mid, and high costs from the 2023 PSP, as well as new low and high cost bookends. Specifically, that high cost bookend was developed by taking current pilot project costs of $10,000 per kilowatt and applying an assumed learning rate into the future. We've now reviewed NREL 2024 ATB, and we are observing that the latest ATB is adopting a similar methodology for all of their cost scenarios. So in the chart on the right, the low curve is the mid cost scenario from the 2023 PSP as well as the 25-26 TPP. The dashed line above is what we presented in AB 1373 as our conservative cost scenario. And the new solid blue line is NREL 2024 ATB's costs. So based on the overall alignment in both methodology and resulting cost between NREL 2024 ATB and our conservative cost scenarios from AB 1373, we feel confident that we can continue to use NREL as our cost source for offshore wind and don't recommend any additional cost modifications at this time. Next slide, please. So putting all of this together, we now have a quick comparison of levelized fixed cost for some of the key technologies represented in the IRP. Quick caveat, for chart legibility, we didn't include every technology. These are just some of the key ones. The total levelized fixed cost being shown here represents the cost to construct new candidate resources, and this is what is actually input into the resolve model as our primary cost metric. The levelized fixed cost includes things like overnight capital costs, construction financing cost, fixed O&M, interconnection, and the ITC. This metric does not include variable costs, such as the VO&M, fuel costs, and the PTC for those utility scale solar and onshore wind resources. Now, a quick note about the data shown here. These are generic technology costs. They've been localized to California, but they don't reflect the specifics of individual projects that are being modeled in the IRP. Those will be produced later in the supplemental information. Next slide, please. We also are showing here now the levelized cost of electricity for these same technologies. And so quick notes on LCOE. This is not a cost input into any IRP models. We can infer LCOE by making assumptions on resource performance and actual output in the IRP models, and you could back calculate these based on the results from Resolve or from SERVM. But this is not an input into the Resolve model. Additionally, LCOE is meant to be a representation of levelized resource costs, and it is by no means a statement on projected PPA prices or expected market prices of electricity. Finally, the capacity factors that are embedded in this chart are representative for each technology and do not necessarily reflect the actual capacity factors that are being used in the IRP. Next slide, please. So finally, to conclude our cost discussion, we want to present some notes on long duration energy storage. So as has been discussed previously, we are proposing for the 2025 INA to include 3 long duration energy storage archetypes as default technologies in the IRP. Those include a generic 12-hour, 24-hour, and 100-hour duration resource. Although the intention is for these resources to be generic and not represent any specific technology, assumptions need to be made to get cost and performance data into our models. To that end, we've developed assumptions for certain representative technologies to use as the basis for those cost and performance metrics. Specifically at this time, we're proposing to use flow battery as the technology for 12-hour, thermal storage as the technology for 24-hour, and iron air battery is the technology for 100-hour. The main motivation for these selections are as follows. First, each of the chosen technologies should be feasible at the given duration. Next, the technology should not have any significant project siting constraints. Third, generally, long duration storage cost should increase with duration. And finally, the round trip efficiency should decline with duration. Now, those are general guiding principles, and this is our first time doing this in the IRP. And so we'd like to hear from stakeholders in the comments any recommended improvements to the approach being taken here. Next slide, please. So we're going to switch gears slightly and talk about how we are mapping our candidate resources to the new resolve zones. Next slide, please. So as was introduced by Angana earlier this afternoon, the new resolve model features three zones to represent the CAISO system. We now have PG&E, SCE, and SDG&E. As part of this new update, we needed to reevaluate the regional map that we've used in previous IRPs to describe our candidate resource regions. Because the old polygons did not strictly align with the IOU boundaries, new polygons were desired to be made. Specifically, when drawing our new resource map, we referred to the study areas that are used by CAISO in the transmission planning process. Taking that data, we've drawn the new map shown on the left, aligning directly with those study areas. So one key advantage of this update is that in future transmission planning processes, there will be direct correlation between the resolve portfolio outputs and the study areas used by the CAISO. Two additional notes on the redrawn map. The CAISO-controlled portions of Arizona in Western Arizona are assumed to be divided between SCE and SDG&E. So we have two different subzones there in Arizona. And also the areas that were previously known as Southern Nevada, including the GLW-VEA systems, are modeled as part of east of Pisgah, that SCE EOP region on the map. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick reference table and figure to showcase the change between previous work and the new map shown in the 2025 INA. Just quick disclaimers here. Although the mappings shown in this table on the left are largely accurate, they are approximate. So if you are trying to benchmark portfolios between vintages of the IRP model, you will see that there are slight discrepancies because the boundaries have shifted. Next slide, please. So with the motivation and results of our new map out of the way, let's now just spend a minute talking through how we actually make our resource assignments. For the technologies that we represent geospatially, those being solar, wind, geothermal, and pumped hydro, each candidate project area is geospatially assigned to one of those CAISO study areas. And that assignment directly is associated with one of the three IOU zones. Next, for our out-of-state resources, wind and geothermal, their assignments to one of the three IOU zones is determined based on their specified tie-in locations to the CAISO system. We'll have more on that in a little bit. All of the offshore wind is assumed to be in PG&E territory. Our distributed solar and biomass resource potentials are split between the three IOU zones. And for most of our other candidate resources, namely our storage and gas thermal technologies, the old candidate resources in previous IRP models have been effectively triplicated to create three resources, one in each of the three zones. So for example, what was previously CAISO lithium-ion 4 hours has now been disaggregated into a PGE, SCE, and SDG&E resource. Next slide, please. So next, we're going to transition into the updates to resource potential and land use constraints. So next slide, please. So to refresh everyone on the approach that's taken in the IRP, our process for developing our candidate resource potential and land use follows these three steps. We start on the left with the raw resource potentials. These include things like solar installation data or wind speed. Additionally, new to the 2025 INA, we've prepared new analysis using temperature at depth estimates to produce an enhanced geothermal resource potential. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. Next, to the raw resource potential rasters, we apply two series of land use screens. First, we have a techno-economic screen to account for feasibility limits on the development of new resources. Those include things like minimum capacity factor thresholds, ground slope restrictions, setbacks from population centers, as well as certain other feasibility screens like setbacks from airports. In addition to the techno-economic screens, we also apply environmental land use screens. So those include protections for protected areas, prime farmland, habitats, and endangered species. Next slide, please. So the details on the techno-economic land use screens are provided in this summary table here. Relative to the 2023 PSP, there hasn't been a whole lot of new work on our techno-economic screen. However, there are two key updates that I want to talk through. First, for our onshore wind, we've received new wind capacity factor data from NREL, which is the same capacity factor data used in the 2024 NREL supply curves. And we've performed a new analysis using that raster and have recommended an update to the minimum capacity factor threshold for onshore wind. So we'll talk about that more in a little bit. And then secondly, we have pulled together a new set of assumptions for our new enhanced geothermal techno-economic screen. This isn't new data development per se, it's just a collection of the pre-existing screens that we've already developed previously. Next slide, please. On the environmental land use screen, we're continuing to use the same data sources that were developed in the 2023 PSP. So specifically for our in-state candidate resources, we're continuing to use the CEC 2023 land use screens for electric system planning. For solar and wind, those are the core land use screens. For geothermal, it will be the protected area exclusions. For our out-of-state candidate resources, we're continuing to use the WEC environmental risk screen. Specifically, classes 3 and 4 make up the exclusion criteria. Next slide, please. So that summarizes the general approach to our land use analysis and candidate resource potential. We're now going to go through technology by technology and talk through some of the key updates. So let's get started. First, for utility scale solar, in December of last year, the BLM released their new 2024 Western Solar Plan. The new plan establishes guidelines for what areas of BLM controlled land is eligible for development for utility scale solar. The new plan establishes exclusion criteria for biological, environmental, or recreational conservation. It also establishes a more stringent ground slope guideline, as well as, importantly, restricting development to areas that are less than 15 miles from existing or planned transmission infrastructure. So staff has reviewed this new data source and has prepared a new analysis comparing the impacts of the BLM Western Solar Plan on the available solar resource potential. Next slide, please. So the impacts of the BLM Western Solar Plan are summarized in these two maps. So the left image reflects the available land under the CEC core land use screen. The right is that same data, but now further filtered to remove the areas that are excluded by the Western Solar Plan. As you can see in the call-out boxes, the main areas affected by the Western Solar Plan are primarily those in the out-of-state regions of east of Pisgah and Arizona, primarily in Southern California. Based on the disproportional impacts of the Western Solar Plan to restrict land availability in Southern California, we're going to recommend some adjustments to how we actually calculate the solar resource potential from that underlying available land area. Next slide, please. So to recap, in the 2023 PSP, the way we estimated our solar resource potential was we took the land area under the CEC core land use screen. We applied an area density factor of 30 megawatts per square kilometer. And then we applied an additional 80% discount to the resulting total to reflect for commercial interest, site control, permitting challenges, and just overall feasibility to actually develop all that solar. After reviewing the new 2024 Western Solar Plan and observing those large reductions in the available land, especially in Southern California, we're recommending a few tweaks to the methodology. Specifically, for the areas of the CAISO system that are significantly impacted by the new Western Solar Plan, we're proposing that we no longer apply any discount to the land area. And then for the areas outside of those, namely all of PG&E, as well as SCE Northern and SCE Metro, we will continue to apply a discount factor, but we've lowered that factor from 80% to 50%. So the resulting accounting of all of these changes are summarized in this table on the right. Starting with the CEC land area potential of 640 gigawatts, the BLM itself removes about 200 gigawatts of that land. And then with the additional reductions we're applying now only to Northern California, the new total solar potential is assumed to be 280 gigawatts. Next slide, please. We'll now move on to our updates to the in-state wind resource potential. So in the 2023 PSP and in the 2023 inputs and assumptions, we presented an analysis for our in-state wind, assessing the trade-offs between assumed minimum viable project capacity factor and the resulting megawatts of resource potential at or above that capacity factor threshold. So the results from that analysis from 2 years ago was we assumed a 28% minimum capacity factor, and that resulted in a total of 13.4 gigawatts of potential, which is the first column in this data table. In the 2025 INA, we've received and analyzed new capacity factor data from NREL, the same data that's used in NREL's 2024 supply curves. We've taken this data and updated the assumed capacity factors for each of the candidate project areas, and we've repeated that same analysis from 2 years ago. We applied successively more stringent minimum capacity factor thresholds and calculated the resulting resource potentials at or above each value. So based on our analysis and reflecting needs for additional reductions to resource potential in certain areas of the state, we are proposing that we adopt a 30% minimum capacity factor threshold for the 2025 INA. In addition to that, reflecting reduced commercial interest in the Southern Nevada part of the CAISO system, we apply a further 50% reduction to the SCE east of Pisgah resource potentials. So the net result in-state wind potential is that 12.35 gigawatt figure in the middle column. Next slide, please. So moving on to hydrothermal, geothermal resources. Here, the data source remains unchanged from the previous INA. We continue to use CEC's data set of known geothermal fields. We've updated the data with the latest vintage of that data set. Additionally, the geothermal fields in the Imperial Valley are assumed to be divided between SCE Eastern and SDG Imperial based on the assumed project tie-in locations. A final update we've made in this INA is we have observed in our new CAISO baseline resource list that there's ongoing development in the geysers as well as in the Salton Sea area. Pursuant to those developments, we've performed some true-ups to our potentials, subtracting those in-development projects from the candidate resource potential. So with all these updates, the new hydrothermal in-state potential is 3.4 gigawatts. Next slide, please. For pumped hydro storage, we do have a few updates to share. In the previous 2023 PSP, we represented 5 candidate pumped hydro projects, in California. In the most recent 25-26 TPP busbar mapping analysis, we expanded that analysis to include an additional 11 pumped hydro fields, bringing the total number of project sites to 16. Of those 16 projects, 14 are now being considered as candidate resources in the resolve model. That increases the overall pumped hydro potential from 3 gigawatts to 16 gigawatts. In addition to this update, we are also further classifying our pumped hydro resources based on whether or not the project sites include or don't include an existing reservoir. Projects with an existing reservoir will use that corresponding resource cost class from NREL ATB, and projects that require 2 new reservoirs will have a more expensive cost assigned to them. Next slide, please. For offshore wind, we have only a few updates to share at this time. Our resource potentials are unchanged from the previous INA. We continue to use the June 2022 AB 525 NREL presentation to establish our areas for the offshore wind projects. And we are using a 5 megawatts per square kilometer density factor to get the potential estimates shown in the table here. The 2 main updates to offshore wind. First, we have removed the Diablo Canyon call area from consideration in the analysis. And second, we have postponed the first available year for Cape Mendocino and Del Norte to reflect the feasible development timelines. Next slide, please. For out-of-state wind, we have a couple of new updates to share. In the previous 2023 PSP, the amount of out-of-state wind potential that was presented reflected our land use analysis using the WEC environmental screens for Idaho, New Mexico, and Wyoming. The potentials were very large, tens of gigawatts per state. In recent months, we've been reassessing our approach to the out-of-state wind potentials, and we realized that the real constraining factor to our out-of-state potentials is not the land availability, but rather it's the transmission that's required to deliver those resources to the CAISO system border. So based on that, we've revised our out-of-state wind potentials to reflect the transmission constrained estimates. So the values shown in the table, we have about 9 gigawatts of New Mexico wind, another 9 gigawatts of Wyoming wind, and 1.1 gigawatts of Idaho wind available to the model. Now, the specific first available years and actual deliverability pathways to get those resources to California will be discussed in a future section later this afternoon. But I want to call out specifically that we are introducing a new option for Wyoming wind to interconnect directly to the PGE system. So this gives Northern California another opportunity to get a high capacity factor resource in our new zonally disaggregated model. Final update here is that we've removed Utah wind from consideration in the IRP. Next slide, please. For out-of-state geothermal, the data source for our potentials also has not changed since the 2023 PSP. We model out-of-state candidate geothermal in Nevada, Oregon, and Utah. The major update to our out-of-state geothermal is that we're modeling now new tie-in locations for the Nevada geothermal. In the previous INA, I believe we only represented El Dorado as the tie-in location for that resource, and we now give it 3 alternates for places where projects can interconnect to CAISO. Importantly, this also includes one option for Nevada geothermal to tie in directly to PG&E. Final update to our out-of-state geothermal is that we've renamed the resource previously called Pacific Northwest Geothermal has been renamed to Oregon Geothermal to reflect the actual location of those candidate projects. Next slide, please. So the table and figure on this slide is meant to be a helpful visual summary of the updates to our mapping of the out-of-state candidate resources. Specifically on the right, the new lines in purple reflect options that are new to the 2025 INA. So as we discussed previously, we have 3 new options for Nevada geothermal, including one option into the Malin substation in Northern California. We have a new Wyoming wind tying into Tesla. We also have a new New Mexico wind option to go to the Lugo substation. So this gives Resolve more options to expand its out-of-state resource portfolio and also allows for more diversity in how those out-of-state resources will utilize the in-state CAISO transmission. Next slide, please. So we now are going to segue a bit into the new developments on enhanced geothermal. So as we introduced previously in the 2025 INA and for this upcoming IRP cycle, we're proposing to add both near field and deep enhanced geothermal as new default technologies. These would both be represented as binary technologies. Specifically, our near field enhanced geothermal is assumed to represent additional resource potential that can be extracted adjacent to the known hydrothermal fields. To develop our near field EGS potential, we adopt an assumption from NREL, where they assume that the amount of extractable power from the known hydrothermal fields can effectively be doubled by use of additional extraction techniques. So for this reason, our near field EGS potential is assumed to be equal to the hydrothermal resource potential. Next, on our deep EGS, we've developed a new methodology inspired by previous work from Princeton, NREL, and Stanford to convert temperature at depth data into estimates of the extractable electric power from those reservoirs. Next slide, please. To go into the details on the new methodology a little bit more, we start our deep EGS analysis by taking temperature at depth estimates from a recent Stanford publication. The data is presented to us in depths of 1 kilometer bands ranging from 3 to 7 kilometers at a resolution in the XY plane of 4 kilometers. Using this temperature data, we then apply empirical formulae developed by NREL to convert the temperatures into the potential electric capacity of the rock reservoirs. The data used in that conversion is shown in that table on the bottom right. Once we have the estimated power from each cubic meter cell, we then sum across all the depths to get an area density factor of the resource potential. With that megawatt per kilometer squared area density of the power, we then apply an 80 percentile haircut to remove lower performing sites from the analysis. The motivation for this is that the remaining highest 20 percentile of candidate project sites represent those where the yield would be highest and would be the area of focused development for new EGS projects. Once we have that high 20 percentile of project sites collected, we then apply a series of land use screens to reflect techno-economic and environmental exclusions. And again, the techno-economic screens are the ones that we showed on an earlier slide. The environmental screens here are the protected areas exclusions for the in-state EGS, and it's the WEC categories 3 and 4 for out-of-state EGS. Next slide, please. So the results of the new analysis are shown in this table on the right. We assume that enhanced geothermal is available for procurement in California, Oregon, Nevada, Idaho, and Utah. As I mentioned previously, the near field EGS is assumed to be equal to the conventional hydrothermal potentials. For the deep EGS, the overall potential was over 100 gigawatts. Based on this, and recognizing that the cost to extract geothermal at greater depths will incur greater costs, we're proposing at this time to only include the potentials at a 3 kilometer depth in our IRP models. If in the future we see large quantities of this resource being selected, we can revisit this assumption to allow additional tranches of enhanced geothermal at increased cost. Next slide, please. Two final slides we have to share on our candidate resource assumptions. First, on our wind and geothermal near-term build limits. We've developed these limits between 2026 and 2030 by reviewing the CAISO interconnection queue, Cluster 15 project queue, as well as queues from neighboring jurisdictions. The motivation here is to restrict resolve to only selecting these resources among projects that are already in development in California and in neighboring jurisdictions. So the sum totals shown in this table are effectively maximum build limits in resolve between 2026 and 2030. And then after that year, the generic first available year assumptions will prevail. Next slide, please. Finally, we also have revisited our near-term limits for utility scale solar. In the previous INA in 2023 PSP, we presented a 3 gigawatt per year cap on the amount of solar that could be procured, and that was for the first 3 years of the modeling horizon. The motivation for this cap was that based on recent project interconnection and energization data, we observed that installations had not exceeded 3 gigawatts in recent years. So we've double-checked those numbers looking at the latest CAISO master generating capability list, as well as data from LBNL, and we've observed that in more recent years, the amount of installations has in fact exceeded 3 gigawatts. So going forward, and in this INA, we're recommending that the limit be augmented to 4 gigawatts per year, and that would apply in 2026, 2027, and 2028. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll turn things over to my colleague Maddie, who will talk us through some transmission interconnection updates.
Thanks, Sam. As Sam mentioned, I'll be discussing how transmission is represented in Resolve. Next slide, please. Resolve includes transmission deliverability limits on candidate resource builds, and in addition to these existing transmission limits, Resolve can optimally select upgrades to relieve these limits, either using CAISO-identified upgrades or generic upgrades if the CAISO upgrades are exhausted or cost prohibitive. In addition to transmission deliverability constraints, Resolve also models existing interconnection constraints as well as candidate interconnection upgrades that can be optimally selected to relieve the interconnection constraints. Next slide, please. The transmission constraints adopted in Resolve reflect the data in the CAISO's representation of the transmission system in the TPP, as well as the 2024 CAISO Transmission Capability White Paper. Each constraint in Resolve is populated with transmission capability white paper data on existing transmission capability, upgrades, incremental transmission capability provided by said upgrades, project costs, and construction time. The constraints are set up to satisfy both on-peak and off-peak conditions, where the on-peak or full capacity deliverable status conditions are established from the highest and secondary system needs, while the off-peak conditions are established from energy-only periods. A matrix mapping each constraint to a substation is developed to cluster substations across like constraint assignments. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the transmission capability estimates are collected from the Transmission Capability White Paper, and these estimates are based on generator capacity online on or before January 1st, 2024. For a single transmission constraint, the figure on the right provides a visualization of the constraint, where the blue line represents the supply curve associated with the single constraint. The red line represents the earmarked capacity assigned to that constraint and the baseline utilization of the constraint. And then the blue line can increase given the procurement of an upgrade for that constraint. Next slide, please. To assign candidate resources to constraints, they are first assigned to substations listed in the Transmission Capability White Paper. Then, using the substation constraint matrix that I mentioned earlier, transmission clusters are established based on a substation's memberships to constraints. This substation and constraint assignment and subsequent cluster development is visualized in an example figure on the right of this slide. And in this simplified example, each square is a substation. Each substation is assigned to various constraints, with some stations having memberships to multiple constraints. And then based on these substation constraint memberships, clusters are formed. When we aggregate substations based on like memberships in this example, 3 different clusters are created, and this process scales to the many constraints in substations. For each technology, each cluster represents a decision variable in Resolve with a specified resource potential, first available year, and build cost. Next slide, please. Within Resolve, the transmission constraints are used to dictate the build-out of resources in Resolve, And the build resources are subsets of the dispatch resources. Build resources are subject to these transmission constraint bounds, while the dispatch resources adopt the operational parameters for the resources to dispatch in Resolve. Next slide, please. To address potential shortcomings in the upgrades identified by CAISO, Resolve includes generic transmission upgrades to allow for greater resource builds as needed. These generic constraints allow for 500 megawatts of incremental capability per year, and they are first available in 2037. In the input data, we've updated the cost, which represents generic 500 kV lines at an estimated cost of approximately $1 billion per gigawatt. These costs were informed by quotes for in-development transmission projects in California. And these upgrades are built and selected by the model when all the capability and CAISO constraints are exhausted, or if the unselected CAISO upgrades are cost prohibitive. Next slide, please. Resolve also captures the role that out-of-state resources play in the transmission of the CAISO system. For each out-of-state resource, a likely intertie substation, resource build limits, and delivery costs, which are inclusive of the new transmission investment and wheeling charges, are calculated. Substation tie-in locations are informed by the bus bar mapping analysis conducted in coordination with the CAISO. Build limits and costs are informed by metrics from in-development transmission projects in the WEC and previous CAISO studies such as the CAISO 20-year Transmission Outlook Report. If appropriate metrics cannot be extrapolated from specific in-development transmission projects, generic cost assumptions are adopted from the zonal level, or excuse me, the IOU level per unit cost guides. Next slide, please. The out-of-state resources that are represented in Resolve include New Mexico wind, Idaho wind, Wyoming wind, Nevada geothermal, Utah geothermal, Oregon geothermal, and enhanced geothermal from Nevada, Utah, Oregon, and Idaho. Utah wind was removed because it has historically not been selected, there has been no commercial interest, and it has a relatively low capacity factor. Across the out-of-state resource candidates, there is another distinction between in-development and generic transmission projects, and for some resources, such as New Mexico wind, there are multiple tranches of that resource to capture the varying capacities, costs, tie-in locations, and first available years. Further, in some instances, like Wyoming wind, there are different tranches tying in the resource potential across a zone instead of just concentrated at one tie-in location. Next slide, please. Introduced in the 2025-26 TPP and new to the 2024-2026 IRP cycle, additional constraints have been added to Resolve to represent feasible limits on each candidate resource cluster based on interconnection headroom. Each bus bar is assigned a default capacity value based on its voltage. These bus bars, as mentioned previously, are assigned to a transmission cluster so that the total headroom of each cluster is the sum of the capacities across all of the buses. Therefore, the total nameplate rating of all resources built within a cluster cannot exceed this value. Further, clusters that primarily consist of bus bars at or above 230 kV will be allowed to upgrade and build additional buses within that cluster to expand the available headroom for resources to interconnect. These upgrades are populated with cost data from the per unit cost summary table from the latest CAISO 20-year Transmission Outlook Report and are assumed to have a 5 to 7 year construction lead time. The first available year of these interconnection upgrades is modeled as 2032. The adoption of these constraints helps better represent real-world limitations of the transmission constraints. And to reiterate, these are additional constraints to the existing transmission constraints. I'll now be passing the presentation on to Patrick, who will be discussing operating assumptions.
Sorry, Maddie, I'm going to hop in here for a little bit before passing it over to Patrick. And just noting, thanks everyone for submitting their Q&As into the Q&A list. Staff, we are working through and trying to answer them as they come in. I will note that oftentimes it's the case as the questions come in during the presentation, the key person who is able to answer them is the person presenting, so they cannot get to it until they have finished. So just please be patient as we answer the questions. And with that, I think you can go to the next slide, and I can hand it off to Patrick. Sam.
Good afternoon, everyone. Next slide. So first, we'll start off with the basic inputs for load and generation profiles that are the basis of what we model in SERV-M and Resolve. Next slide, please. So first, we start with weather, because the hourly profiles in both models are ultimately based on a weather distribution. Both SERV-M and Resolve's load and renewable generation hourly profiles are derived from 23 historical weather years to account for a broad range of variability. SERV-M directly models all 8760 hours of each weather year, whereas Resolve samples days from the 23 weather year set in a way that reasonably represents the range of conditions that are present in the 23-year set. In SERV-M, weather is also used to model output derating for thermal power plants in the CAISO region. This is a new feature in SERV-M for this IRP cycle. The IRP 2023 preferred system plan cycle, that's the prior cycle, used 1998 through 2020 as the historical range. In SERV-M, Resolve's profiles for that cycle were developed independently from the weather data that SERV-M used. For this cycle, the range is updated to 2000 through 2022. We dropped 1998 and 1999 from the range because the high resolution offshore wind speed data set that we are using starts from 2000. So we want to keep everything lined up together using the same weather years. Also for this cycle, Resolve, as I mentioned, is developing its profiles from the same 23 weather year distribution used in SERV-M. So this brings the models closer together in terms of input consistency. Next slide, please. So here's a little more detail on the steps we took to develop weather-based load profiles. On the left are a couple of bullets talking about how the forecasts were developed. I think this was already mentioned earlier. Electric demand forecasts for California regions are derived from the Energy Commission's IPR forecasts, and the electric demand forecasts for non-California regions were discussed earlier as well, and they're derived from any available IRP filings from external regions, and if not, then FERC Form 714 data. Now for the load profiles, the steps on the right side of the slide illustrate the details of how we did this. First, we gathered weather data and CAISO EMS data. That is the actual weather and the actual sales data that occurred in history. And then we reconstitute historical consumption from sales by removing behind the meter PV effects, demand response, and grid storage charging that all occurred in history. And we reconstitute what we call historical consumption because that's what's correlated with underlying weather. Then we train a regression model using the most recent 3 years available, 2020 through 2022. And that is based on historical consumption and weather. And we use the parameters from that regression model to build out a full 23 weather years of hourly consumption demand profiles. Then we take those 23 weather years of hourly consumption profiles and scale them up to the desired annual peak and energy forecasts. And the final step is layering in the future forecast of demand modifiers, which includes, at least for California regions, additional achievable energy efficiency, additional achievable fuel substitution, electric vehicle charging load, behind the meter PV penetration, and behind the meter storage penetration. And those are all directly drawn from the Energy Commission's IRP forecast. Next slide. This just covers briefly what we do for modeling hydro. The monthly hydro parameters that are inputs for SERVM are based on EIA historical settlement data and also drawn from the years 2000 through 2022. And they include parameters like the daily energy budget, the maximum and minimum hydro dispatch on an average day per month, and also the maximum hydro dispatch for any given month. Resolve also developed their model inputs for hydro from the same data set used in SERVM. For this cycle, we also split out run-of-river and non-run-of-river hydro into separate categories so that the performance of those two types of resources could be isolated in the models for purposes of showing how they dispatch and for modeling the ELCC of those two kinds of hydro. Next slide. So I'll hand off to my colleague David Miller now, who's going to talk a little bit about how we develop the weather-based solar and wind profiles.
Okay, so we develop solar profiles used in SERVM for clusters of solar resource locations in addition to specified city centers for behind-the-meter PV. We use NREL's system advisor model, PV watts calculator, trained on CAISO settlement data using NREL National Solar Radiation Database for the 23 weather years that Patrick just mentioned, in order to account for solar insolation and cloud cover by geographic region. We created profiles for fixed tilt, single axis, and double axis tracking, as well as for behind the meter PV. And utility scale, solar uses a default inverter loading ratio of 1.3, and behind the meter PV uses 1.13. Next slide, please. So the normalized wind profiles that are used in SERVM are developed in two different ways, depending on whether or not we have historical production data. And in the case where we do not have historical production data, we use the velocity approach. So in this approach, we build our normalized hourly wind production profiles from hourly wind speed data, along with an appropriate power response curve and a multiplicative transmission loss factor. And this covers all offshore as well as onshore locations where production data is not available. And we use the wind speed data for offshore from the NREL's National Offshore Wind data set. And onshore, we use the Copernicus ERA5 reanalysis data set. When we do have historical production data, we use a Monte Carlo approach. And in this case, the normalized hourly wind production profiles are generated from a set of random draws from the data, the production data, which has been aggregated and normalized. And then we resort this data using velocity data based on the nearest neighbor modeled wind speed profiles. So this approach ensures consistency with observed monthly historical wind production. And also, when we resort the random Monte Carlo draws by the velocity profiles, this imposes historical correlations with load and solar. And this is an improvement over the onshore velocity approach, which can tend to systematically undervalue onshore wind production in periods of high load. Next slide, please. So I just want to take a minute to discuss the evolution of the CPUC wind model. And in particular, I want to just briefly describe two upgrades to the model. The first upgrade is we are now using historical wind production data whenever it is available. And again, as I mentioned earlier, previous versions attempted to develop normalized wind profiles from velocity profiles and a response function. But this approach tends to systematically undervalue wind production in periods of high load. However, for the offshore locations, the NREL Now dataset will overcome some of these limitations. Second, we now are aggregating our regions in a different way. In previous versions, we generated wind weather stations at very high spatial resolution. And we found that this tended to result in overestimating the wind production potential due to diversity interactions between production sites. The current wind model more accurately captures historical wind production without adding excess diversity. And this is because we're using larger areas to aggregate the wind production. And this causes, so in the previous model, this caused wind production to be overestimated. And as a result, the modeled wind production in the current profiles in certain locations will have declined since the previous cycle. I will pass it back to Patrick. Or Sam, am I passing it back to Sam? Next slide.
You're passing it off to Sam.
Okay.
Thanks, David.
Sure thing.
Is I'm going to walk us through just the application of the newly developed wind and solar profiles to our candidate resources. So we'll start here with solar. The map on the right is the new regional map that we presented a little bit ago. And the table here shows the comparison between the previous INA and today's new INA, showing which weather station is being assigned to each of our new resource regions. The key updates here for solar is that because we have a few new regions in the PG&E service territory, we have made new assumptions for which profiles to use. But overall, the results are pretty similar to 2023 PSP. Next slide, please. Similarly, here are the new assignments that are being made for our in-state wind regions. As David just discussed, we've changed how the weather model is producing these new profiles. And so the number of individual weather stations has gone down. And so we've made assignments based on those profiles to each of the new wind resource regions. Next slide, please. So here on the next couple of slides, we'll just present some quick benchmarking from the 2023 INA to the 2025 INA, showcasing how the annual average capacity factors have changed for certain resources. So on this slide, we're looking at the baseline solar resources for both in-state and out-of-state resources. Within CAISO, because we have now disaggregated the resolve model into the 3 different IOUs, we see that the previous 30.7% capacity factor has now been localized into 3 unique values for the 3 different IOUs. The way that these capacity factors were calculated was every solar generator in our baseline resource list is assigned to a weather station, and that corresponding profile is taken and averaged across all of the generators within each zone to get this zonal average profile. So the newly disaggregation of our model results in these 3 new profiles for CAISO. Similarly, we have updated profiles for our non-CAISO baseline solar resources. And the biggest adjustments here are due to some corrections of where we're mapping specific generators in our baseline to certain weather stations. So some new mappings there have resulted in some new variation in our capacity factors. Next slide, please. Now, here are the comparison results for candidate solar. And as I discussed previously, most of the weather station assignments are unchanged. And so as you can see in the relative deltas there, those are relative, not absolute. The magnitude of the change is overall quite small. Next slide, please. And here we have similar data for our baseline wind profiles. And as David discussed, there have been some major developments in the wind model, and so that's driving a lot of the new capacity factors that we're seeing on this slide. Specifically, our in-state, in-CAISO renewable profiles have now been disaggregated into the 3 different IOU zones. Additionally, for our SCE wind, previously we assumed that all of the contracted wind used the same generation profile. In this new approach, we've now split out the remote wind that's contracted to SCE and given those resources their own capacity factor in their own profile. So that's the separate carve out we have there for out-of-state SCE wind. And then again, for our non-CAISO baseline wind resources, we have new capacity factor estimates, and a lot of the delta there, in addition to the new wind model, is driven by some reassignments of those baseline generators to weather stations. Next slide, please. Finally, here are the comparison of capacity factors for our candidate wind. This includes both the onshore and offshore wind. Again, most of the deltas here are due to the new wind capacity factor model. We also have new offshore wind data shown here. And a quick note about the new capacity factors for offshore wind in the 2025 INA column is that these values align fairly closely to the 2022 NREL offshore wind report. So we're feeling a little bit better about these numbers than the old numbers. With that, I will turn things over to, forgive me, I don't remember who's next. Let me check.
It's gonna be
Turn things over to Angana. Apologies.
Next slide, please. This section is covering the updates made to the resolve representative sample days. Next slide, please. As all capacity expansion models, similarly Resolve relies on sample days to be able to make the optimization problem size reduced and manage the runtime. And similar to last cycle, we relied on K-medioid clustering algorithm to create our sample days. The updates made this cycle are regarding the weather years, as it was covered earlier about the profile. So this cycle, we're using weather year information data starting from 2000 to the end of 2022, so that covers 23 weather years. And we use hourly load data, hourly wind and solar generation, and hydro energy budgets to create our clustering or run our clustering algorithm to get this sample representative periods. Similar to last cycle, we have 36 sample days that this clustering algorithm finds based on the similarity of the historical data and designates these sample days to be the representative of the historical data. Next slide, please. Here is the workflow, the summary of the workflow that helps us to get the sample days and also perform some quality control checks. So starting from the first step, we do correlation analysis to make sure that our wind and solar profiles are distinct and informative and reduce or remove the ones that are repeated information in our clustering algorithm. In the second step, we run our clustering algorithm and rely on root mean square error as the metric to minimize the clustering error. After running the clustering method, we get the sample days and then we run some performance checks. These performance checks are related to energy representation, calendar distribution, hydro budget, gross load, and load resource correlation. Next slide, please. There are several criteria that we use to find our best performing sample days. Here, the summary of those different criteria are presented. Starting from the beginning, our first criterion, we look into the energy representation to make sure that the capacity factors in sample days after we perform the clustering are within the range of expected capacity factors. Sample days are generally designed to cover the averages, but with this post screening, we are ensuring that there is a good coverage on low renewable days, high renewable days, and there is not over-reliance on specific type of renewable production. In addition to that, we take a look at the distribution of the sample days to make sure that it is It has a good distribution across all 12 months and days of the week, and it has days that are representative of the weekends as well as weekdays. Hydro budget representation is another factor that we look into to make sure that the water years or the sample days that are created are covering a range of water year conditions, starting from very low hydro years all the way to more water-rich years. Gross load representation is another criteria we use. Sample day profiles represent average expected diurnal and seasonal load patterns, so we pay attention that the post sample days we are able to see a reasonable behavior and patterns in the gross load. And lastly, we look and pay attention to the net load as well, so make sure that the net load shapes capture the variation in both renewable and loads as observed in the historical data. Next slide, please. This table shows the 36 sample days that came from this clustering process. The percentages shown in this table are showing the share of the data, the historical data that each sample day represents. So that is covering a range of 0.3% to about 5%. And these 2 days, for example, highlighted in this table are showing some of the interesting parts of the days or distinguishing the days that have higher curtailment spring days or high net load winter day they don't have a very large representation in the historical data. And on the right side, this figure shows that selecting about these 36 days are within the range of representative days that give us a good value for reducing the error of the clustering, and increasing the number of representative days beyond this range does not seem to be giving us a lot of reduced error in representation. So I feel good about having 36 sample days that capture a various range of load, renewable, and hydro condition in the system. Next slide, please. Here are some snapshots of those variations that we observe in winter and summertime. So the red part of the figure shows the historical observation, the raw historical data, and the gray lines show representative days. As you can see, for solar, wind, and net load, those representative days are covering a wide range in both summer and winter seasons. That wraps up this section, and I will pass it over to, I think, Madeline.
Thanks, Angana. I'll be discussing updates to the transmission topology representation as it relates to the new zonally disaggregated resolve model. Next slide, please. As was mentioned by Angana in earlier slides, updates to resolve include the disaggregation of the CAISO zone into 3 zones, PG&E, SCE, and SDG&E. With that disaggregation of the model topology comes disaggregation of some input data, including that for transmission. This cycle includes updated transmission path ratings and hurdle rates. And for this data, the WEC 2032 anchor dataset was used to calculate the transmission flow limits and hurdle rates between resolve zones. There are path limits between the CAISO zones, but there is a hurdle rate of $0. This data and the images on the right side of this slide represent the baseline and existing input data for the resolve model. Next slide, please. Another update incorporated into the model is the ability for resolve to optimally select interzonal transmission upgrades, a key benefit of the zonally disaggregated model. There are physical limitations related to the interzonal path limits. Between SDG&E and SCE, planned upgrades effective in 2034 will effectively eliminate path limits for a single zone treatment. However, the path between PG&E and SCE, otherwise known as Path 26, has a high utilization rate, and by modeling all 3 zones, Resolve now has the option to select proposed transmission expansion between these 2 zones. Next slide, please. This PG&E to SCE path expansion is available in Resolve as a transmission upgrade and is available in multiple tranches that vary by incremental capacity implied system upgrades, first available year, and cost. There are 3 upgrade tranches being modeled, with incremental capacity ranging from 1 to 5.5 gigawatts, first available years of 2033 to 2037, and costs ranging from $600 million to $6 billion. The incremental capacity offered by each upgrade tranche is bidirectional, providing the same incremental flow value in both the PG&E to SCE direction as well as the SCE to PG&E direction. We won't be walking through each number shown in this table individually, but we encourage stakeholders to review this data, especially the first available years, and are soliciting feedback. Moving on to our next topic of discussion related to updates to our transmission topology, Josh will walk us through our approach for remote generators and specified imports. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Maddie. As Maddie mentioned, we'll be discussing the modeling of remote generators and specified imports, starting with the remote generators, which we define as units that are physically located in one model region and contracted to serve energy to a different model region. So an example would be a resource that is physically located in the Southwest region, but is contracted to serve energy for SCE load. Starting in this cycle, in Resolve, we'll be modeling these remote generators in special remote zones, which allows Resolve to better align with the servo model and better account for the transmission usage of the remote generators. These remote zones are going to be very similar to the CAISO Northwest Hydro Zone we've modeled going several cycles back. So that is a specific zone for the Northwest Hydro that delivers energy to CAISO. On the bottom two text boxes here on this slide, we're showing key comparisons of how remote generators were modeled in the previous cycle and the current cycle. 2 things that haven't changed. First, that the remote generators are delivering energy to serve CAISO loads, and that includes greenhouse gas-free energy for qualifying resources like solar. Second, that remote generators do not contribute firm resource adequacy to CAISO, and that they are modeled within the 4 gigawatt limit for import resource adequacy, which will be discussed in more detail by Aaron in the later section. What has changed in this cycle is in the previous cycle, remote generators were modeled as in-CAISO resources. And in this cycle, we are moving them into these remote zones and accounting for their transmission use in a more accurate way. It's worth noting that there are only going to be baseline resources in these remote zones. There are no candidate resources that are eligible to be placed in these zones. Next slide, please. So here we're going to build up an example of our remote generator topology step by step, starting with this larger circle, the Southwest zone, which is unchanged from previous cycles. It has the resources that are located in Southwest and contracted to serve Southwest loads, and it has bidirectional transmission ties with other regions in the model, which was in the transition topology graph Maddie presented a few slides ago. We're going to layer on the smaller circle, which is the remote zone. In this example, SCE Southwest remote. So the convention we're going to follow for these zones is the contracted zone, SCE, underscore the physical zone, Southwest, underscore remote, and that will be the naming convention for every remote zone in Resolve. So this zone will only have the resources that are remote generators in the Southwest, but contracted to serve SCE. There is no load in this remote zone, and so this essentially forces the remote generators to dispatch and send their energy to CAISO, which will travel over a single direction transmission path from this remote zone into CAISO, or in this case, SCE. And this transmission path will have a $0 hurdle rate, which will discourage curtailment of non-emitting remote generators like wind or solar in the model. Next slide, please. So now layering on the transmission paths in this example. The top line here between SCE and Southwest proper is essentially the regional transmission transfer capability which Maddie went through on the transmission path diagram a few slides ago, going about a little over 9 gigawatts in both directions. Then we're going to add in sort of a pseudo transmission tie, which is represented by the bottom line, used for the remote resources. So this is going in a single direction towards SCE in this example, with a path rating of about 2.6 gigawatts, which equals the nameplate capacity of the remote resources in this region. So in the real world, the remote generators do not have their own transmission line. It is really a subset of the broader transmission path between SCE and Southwest, represented by the top line here. So to reflect that, we do have a simultaneous flow limit, and that's equal to 9.2 gigawatts here, which matches the 9.2 gigawatts path rating between Southwest and SCE. And so what this means is that at any given time in the model, the combined transmission usage of the remote generators and of any unspecified imports from the Southwest combined cannot exceed 9.2 gigawatts. Next slide, please. Moving on to specified imports. So these are very similar to remote generators in that they're physically located in one region, but contracted to serve another. The difference is specified imports also provide firm resource adequacy to the same regions they provide energy for. So a CAISO specified import will be providing energy and resource adequacy to CAISO regardless of its location. We are modeling specified imports very similarly to how we modeled them in past cycles. They are moved into the region they're contracted to. So the specified imports we've historically modeled, which are Hoover, Intermountain, Palo Verde, and Sutter, are modeled as if they are in CAISO resources with firm RA, and this reflects the fact that they have firm transmission into CAISO. The main change for specified imports in this cycle is that we've added 2 in development units as specified imports that are new to the baseline. The first one is SunZia Wind, and this is modeled as a specified import to reflect that SunZia Wind is being built with new firm transmission that CAISO has operational control over, so it will be able to deliver both energy and RA to CAISO. The second is Cape Station Geothermal, and this is modeled as a specified import to reflect its MTR contract, which indicates that it should also be able to provide firm RA. As these 2 units progress towards operations, we will reevaluate their firm RA status and likewise reevaluate whether we should continue modeling them as specified imports. Next slide, please. And we want to conclude this subsection with a note on how we model the out-of-state candidate resources, which Sam discussed at length earlier. There is no change in how we model these resources from previous cycles, but it is a question we get from stakeholders often, so we do want to take this opportunity to clarify. We do model out-of-state candidate resources very similar to the specified imports we described on the previous slide, in that we're modeling them as if they are located in CAISO. So to clarify, all the out-of-state candidate resources, if they're selected by the model, they are contracted to CAISO in full. So for example, if you see Wyoming wind get selected in the model, 100% of that capacity is being delivered to CAISO. It will also, as Sam discussed earlier, have new firm transmission lines that allow these resources to deliver both energy and firm RA to CAISO. And as a result, out-of-state candidate resources fall outside the 4 gigawatt unspecified import limit for RA, which Aaron will discuss later. And they also fall outside of the simultaneous flow constraints into CAISO in California, since they're using new transmission. Next slide, please. And we'll finish section 6 here with a brief look on how our fuel prices are modeled in the model that has a zonal disaggregation of CAISO. Next slide, please. Our methodology for fuel prices is very similar to previous cycles. The source for our prices, including the natural gas prices, are the same. So in the case of natural gas, that source is the IRP 2023 NAM gas model. What's different is because we have this disaggregated model, we no longer have a CAISO-wide or a California-wide price. In Resolve, we're able to forecast different prices for each of the zones, PG&E, SCE, and SDG&E. And as you can see on the right, this means there's a noticeable difference between the gas price in PG&E and the other two CAISO zones. For uranium and biomass, we continue modeling these fuels as having the same price across all zones. There's very little geographic variation. And uranium, that we are continuing to get that source from EIA, and biomass and biogas, the source remains the same, which is an NREL study. And I will now pass it off to Aaron to discuss our reliability topics.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Good to be here with you. So I'll be talking about our updates to the reliability inputs for Resolve. Next slide, please. And one more. Great. So I wanted to just ground this next discussion, starting with this slide, recognizing that each resource that we will consider within the IRP process is imperfect in its own way. So we have this concept shown on the right here of a perfect capacity resource. This is a useful modeling construct for us in loss of load modeling, like the SERVM analysis done to support the IRP proceeding. But we have to recognize that each resource type has its own operational limitations. So variable resources have uncertain output. Other resources have use limitations due to physical or environmental constraints, and firm capacity also is subject to outages as well as fuel supply disruptions. So we want to use an accreditation methodology in the long-term planning process that can recognize the limitations of each resource as well as their ability to contribute to resource adequacy. Next slide, please. So the approach that we'll describe, which is similar to the approach taken in the last IRP cycle, is to use the effective load carrying capability method, or ELCC method, to accredit all resources, so that accredits all of the resources on the last slide relative to a perfect capacity generator, which is defined as having 100% ELCC. And so when we do that, and this is also building off some of the analysis that we presented in the last IRP cycle, when you accredit all of your resources using ELCC, you also have to adapt the way that you define your reliability need to be consistent with that accreditation approach. So you can see here in this conceptual diagram, on the left side of this graph, we have none of the resources accounted using ELCC, so all of the resources accounted using installed capacity, and that leads to a higher percentage planning reserve margin above the 1 and 2 peak demand. And as we accredit resources using more accurate calculations of ELCC, you can see that the need declines, because instead of capturing those operational limitations in a higher reliability need, we're instead capturing them in the accreditation via ELCC. And so that results in a 14 to 16% what we call a perfect capacity planning reserve margin. I'll show a little bit more detail on this shortly, how we derive that, assuming that all resources are accredited against that need with ELCC. Next slide, please. So these are the updated planning reserve margin analysis results for this IRP cycle. This is based on analysis done using the SERVM model. And we performed a planning reserve margin study in each of the 4 years shown in the table on the left. And then on the graph on the right, we have a sample set of analysis from the 2035 PRM study. And so the way that you do a target planning reserve margin study is you take your system and you look at different levels of installed capacity and you simulate that system using your loss of load probability Monte Carlo simulations. And you can map out the points shown here to draw out this curve. And the curve represents how much installed capacity you have versus the loss of load expectation measured in days per year. So if we want to meet the CPUC's 1 day in 10 target reliability standard, we'll draw a line on this curve at 0.1 days per year or 1 day every 10 years. And then we will look how much capacity is installed to determine the planning reserve margin. And in these simulations, we've replaced all of the resources with perfect capacity, recognizing that in the accreditation side of the accounting, we will accredit those resources using their perfect capacity equivalent, or ELCC. So when we do that, we see that roughly a 15% planning reserve margin, a PCAP PRM is required in 2035 to meet the 1 day in 10 standard. And then in the table on the left, you can see that that is generally consistent across the planning horizon between a little over 14 to about 15.5% across the 4 years that we studied. And one benefit of using a PCAP planning reserve margin approach is that it does provide a relatively durable definition of reliability need that's solely based on the amount of operating reserves that are needed and the interannual load variability. So all of the resource changes that happen in the planning portfolios that Resolve will consider, all of the impacts of that on reliability are captured on the accreditation side. And then we can measure, as we've done here, we measured that reserve margin by taking the total perfect capacity that is required to achieve the reliability target. This is also called the total reliability need. And we measure that above the CERVM median gross peak. Next slide, please. So now on to how we accredit resources in Resolve's accounting. As I mentioned earlier, we are continuing the ELCC for all approach used in the prior cycle, and this has a few key benefits. So the first is that it creates a level playing field using this common metric of ELCC across all resources. So that is a fair way to properly account for all use limitations for both firm and non-firm resources. And then as noted, it is not portfolio dependent, so that creates a more stable definition of need across the planning horizon. And then lastly, this approach in combination with iterative checks of Resolve outputs in CERVM has proven to produce reliable portfolios in past cycles. I will note that the base year for the ELCC studies performed was updated in this cycle from 2030 to 2035, recognizing that we're looking continuously further out with each successive IRP cycle, and that we want to capture some of the electrification load growth and additional resource interactions a little bit further in the planning horizon focused on 2035. And then another key update is adding an additional dimension to the solar and storage surface, which I'll be talking about shortly. Next slide, please. So this set of diagrams may be familiar to folks. These are concepts that we've been talking about in the IRP proceeding, and even prior to that in some of the RPS calculator work in the past. So when we think about capacity contributions, we can consider two key dynamics that we want to ensure that we capture in long-term planning. So the first we call saturation effects, and you can see that shown here on the left. For a variable resource like solar, the more solar you add, the more that shifts the reliability risk to other parts of the day when you have less solar. decreasing the marginal contributions to reliability for adding additional solar. So this is saturation effect. And then for energy limited resources like storage, you could see there's a flattening of the net peak, which also means that storage has saturation effects. But if we add solar and storage in combination, we have what we call a diversity benefit, which is also known as a positive interactive effect, where the whole may exceed the sum of its parts. So we get these additional interactions between solar and storage that we want to ensure a method to capture. And then lastly, I'll say the ELCC approach inherently captures both capacity and energy adequacy in the SERVM simulations that are performed. So while we are using a capacity-based multiplier when we apply ELCCs, the analysis that's done to calculate them considers both capacity adequacy and energy adequacy. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of the methodologies that we're using by resource type for accreditation. And I will walk through this graph from left to right. So starting with the first 4 categories, we perform a set of sequential ELCC runs that establish static ELCCs. So these are basically existing resources, and we'd want to accredit their capacity. And we do that by first taking the thermal fleet in aggregate and running a first-in ELCC of that portfolio. So this includes the gas plants, cogen, biomass, geothermal, nuclear. And from that single ELCC, we can then break out resource class level ELCCs based on the relative forced outage rates. Talk more about that in a second. Then we perform a second-in ELCC calculation for the hydro, a third-in ELCC calculation for the existing pumped hydro storage, and a fourth-in ELCC calculation for the existing demand response. So this enables us to capture any interactive effects through this sequential set of ELCC runs. Next, we have the imports. So these are modeled at 4 gigawatts. There are some slides that I'll be presenting after this section that talk about how we derived, or I should say how we validated that 4 gigawatt assumption, and interactions between imports and solar and storage are captured on the solar and storage surface. And then the last 2 categories these are basically the new non-firm resources that are available for Resolve to select from. And these are the ones that have the most interactive effects. So these are captured via curves and surfaces. So the solar and storage contributions are captured through a 3-dimensional ELCC surface. The 3 dimensions are solar, combining utility scale and behind the meter, 4-hour storage, and then 8-hour storage. Similar to the prior cycle, we capture longer duration ELCCs and new demand response as multipliers to the 8-hour storage dimension on that surface. So that captures the additional value or the lower value that those resources may provide relative to 8-hour storage, while also capturing the interactions between adding them and the solar and storage ELCCs. Then for wind, we have, similar to last cycle, 3 individual curves, one for onshore, one for out-of-state wind, and one for offshore. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit more information about that first category, the static ELCCs. So in these first few bullets, we describe how we take that single first-in thermal ELCC calculation, and then we allocate that to the individual resource classes based on their relative forced outage rates. So if you are familiar with a UCAP methodology, that's where you take 1 minus the E4D percentage to derate a resource class. Here, we're basically scaling up that derate of the E4D percentage until the total capacity for the thermal fleet equals the ELCC that we calculated. I'll show the results of that in a second. And then we provide an additional adjustment for bioenergy, cogeneration, and geothermal. This is to account for some of the availability-based D-rates that are currently used in the resource adequacy program to maintain consistency with that data set. Next slide, please. So here we have some of the subclasses within the thermal fleet shown in rows. And then the second column in, we're showing the E4D value from the Servo model. So some of these classes have higher forced outage rates, some have less. And then the third row in, you can see if you just apply a UCAP type D rate, which is 1 minus the E4D, that is the percentage that you would get for that class. And then the column after that is the ELCC. So that's scaling up those E4D D rates so that the aggregate ELCC for the thermal fleet equals the Servo calculated value. And then in the last column, this is after the additional availability-based D rates informed by the NQC list is performed. And then we also show the demand response and hydro and pumped hydro ELCCs in the bottom rows there. Next slide, please. So now moving on to the curves and surface approach that we use for solar, wind, and storage. So this is the basic approach for how to use Servom to develop inputs and validate those inputs in a capacity expansion model. So the first step is to take a loss of load model. So in this case, we use Servom and we perform a set of ELCC calculations using different penetrations of the resource that we're interested in studying on top of an existing portfolio of resources. And then we translate those ELCC study results into linear equations so that we can put those into the linear program that we use in Resolve. Then we perform capacity expansion to create least cost portfolios, and we do a reliability check to validate that we're producing reliable portfolios, and we make tweaks to our inputs to ensure that the model is building the right amount of capacity. Next slide. So here's a visualization of the first 3 steps in that process. So on the left, step number 1, you can see is calculating ELCC at different levels of penetration. So we have the installed capacity in the the x-axis, and then the ELCC on the y-axis. And then in step 2, we can draw lines between those 2 points using linear equations that approximate that curve. And then we can implement those linear equations in the capacity expansion model. So what that gives us is 2 data points that Resolve uses. So the first is the total ELCC, or the portfolio ELCC, that penetration provides. And then the second is the marginal ELCC. And so those in combination allow Resolve to ensure that the total load resource balance of the CAISO is met, and that incremental additions are done optimally at least cost using the marginal values at different points on the curves and the surface. Next slide. Now I'll present the wind ELCC results. So we have in the top right the portfolio ELCC that you get from increasing the 3 categories of wind that we modeled: out of state, offshore, and in-state. And then on the bottom right, the marginal ELCC percentage. So what you can see is that the marginal ELCC declines as you add more. It doesn't decline particularly rapidly. The ELCCs tend to be relatively stable. In part, that's because we have a the system that we're looking at here in 2035 has a substantial amount of energy storage. And so there's some ability to shift energy around the wind output. But the energy output from the wind is supportive within the energy constrained system of its reliability value. And so we see the capacity value often tends to converge with the capacity factor for the wind resource on those very high net load days. One thing I will point out here, so as was noted in the earlier part of today's presentation, the offshore wind resource shapes in CERVM were updated to a new data set. And we did find in the ELCC studies that has led to a drop in the offshore wind ELCCs because of lower output on the high net load days when there is loss of load risk. Next slide, please. So now if we want to think about a surface, so last cycle we had a two-dimensional surface that's shown here. So we would do a set of ELCC studies looking at solar penetration and 4-hour battery penetration and calculate the ELCC at different points on that surface. And then from a plane on that surface, if we look at a single point and the incremental value from that point to the next point on the surface, we can calculate the marginal value of incremental additions. Next slide, please. So in this cycle, as I noted, we are modeling a three-dimensional surface. This is one of the first examples of this used in a resource planning proceeding. And so what we've done is we've added another dimension of the 8-hour storage resource. So that adds a significant number of additional CERVM simulations that we needed to run to parameterize this 3D surface. But it can provide us the same values. So we can get the portfolio ELCC based on the combination of solar 4-hour storage and 8-hour storage. And then we can look at each point on the 3D surface. And depending on which direction you go to the next point that we studied, you can get the marginal ELCC for the solar, for the 4-hour storage, and for the 8-hour storage. So this captures the interactive effects between the rest of the portfolio as we studied it, and these three resources, as well as with high precision, the interactive effects between these three resource classes. Next slide, please. So it's fairly simple to visualize a one-dimensional ELCC curve. It can be challenging to visualize a three-dimensional surface. Here's our attempt to do that with some slices here. So we have these planes looking at the three-dimensional surface values. And then we've taken the values using 70 gigawatts installed capacity of solar in the graph on the right. And we've shown at different penetrations of 4-hour and 8-hour storage what the combined portfolio ELCC is of the three resource categories there. So you can see that the interactive effects are captured, including the saturation between the 4-hour and the 8-hour storage, how the amount of either of those installed influences the incremental capacity value of the other. Next slide, please. So this is just another way to visualize the surface. So here we're showing these heat maps. So in the top left, we have the solar marginal ELCC percentage as a function of solar and 4-hour battery installations. And what we can see here is at the roughly 50 gigawatts of utility and behind the meter storage we have today and 15 gigawatts of 4-hour storage, there's very little incremental value to adding more solar from a reliability perspective. That's why you see the white in the first row or first column. But then you can see as you add more storage without adding more solar, the incremental value of the solar increases. And that's because you need charging energy for that storage and due to those interactive effects I noted earlier. If you look on the top right, heat map, now we're showing the 4-hour storage marginal ELCC. And there we can see that the more solar that you add, the higher the marginal ELCC is for adding more storage. So that's the diversity benefit that I noted earlier. And then in the bottom, we have the 8-hour storage marginal ELCC at different penetrations of 4-hour storage and 8-hour storage. So that's, again, just signaling that this 3-dimensional surface is able to capture those dynamics between the energy and the capacity contributions of the 4 versus the 8-hour storage resources. Next slide. So one of the key things that we discovered in doing these ELCC studies, and that we expect to be an increasing source of attention within this IRP cycle, is the winter reliability risk. And so we took some of our points on the surface. So each of the points on the surface, we do an ELCC calculation, and that is basically a simulation of the CAISO system using SERVM. And from those simulations, we can pull out data on when the reliability risk occurs, how much of it is occurring in the summer versus how much of it is occurring in the winter. And that's what we're showing in the graph shown on this slide. So what we see is when we are adding more solar and more storage, the reliability risk is shifting into the winter. So just as we saw earlier, as California added solar, we shifted the reliability risk from the summer mid-afternoons into the summer early evening. When we're adding these levels of solar and storage, we're shifting the risk all the way out of the summer to periods of the year when you have less solar available. And so we've drawn these little rectangles to show approximate levels of installed capacity based on previous portfolios that IRP has studied. So you can see by 2035 to 2045, we will be transitioning from a summer peaking system to a winter peaking system. And that transition is captured within the solar and storage surface, recognizing that when that transition occurs, that's going to decrease the contributions from solar because of the lower output during the winter. And then it may also change the contributions from storage based on the relative load shapes in the summer versus the winter. So we'll definitely be looking at this when we look at resolve and SERVM results later in this cycle. The rate of how quickly this shift occurs is going to depend on a few uncertain assumptions. So the rate of space heating electrification, how much of the maintenance for thermal can be moved out of the winter, how much wind you have, as well as climate impacts. So these are all a set of uncertain variables that will impact this shift, but we'll be studying this in more detail in this IRP cycle. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we use a similar approach for long duration storage and demand response as last cycle. So this cycle, we're using the 8-hour dimension of the 3D surface, and then we're calculating at different points on that surface what the relative marginal value is of longer duration storage relative to 8-hour batteries. And when we do that, we're capturing both the benefit of having longer duration, but also the lower round trip efficiency that some of the long duration storage resources have. So those two factors, those have opposite directional impacts on the relative ELCCs, and they're both captured in the studies that we performed. So in the top right graph, you can see the multipliers for 12-hour, 24-hour, and 100-hour storage, with the maximum multiplier being around 200% for the 100-hour resource in 2045. And then you can see demand response generally has higher value in the near term. And then as the system becomes more saturated, with storage and becomes more energy constrained, that demand response value relative to 8-hour storage drops significantly to near zero by 2045. Next slide, please. Okay, lastly on reliability. So in addition to the system reliability constraint captured in the PRM and ELCCs, we have a MTR constraint that ensures resolve with the inclusion of the baseline plus optimized resources builds enough new capacity relative to the MTR baseline to satisfy the commission's orders. And so the two major updates here versus the last cycle are that the baseline that is used in this IRP cycle has a lot more MTR resources, thanks to all of the contracting that LSEs have been doing over the last couple of years. So that is the blue section of the stacked bar chart here. So Resolve has less to optimize essentially. And then we also made adjustments based on a recent CPUC decisions to extend the deadline for the long lead time procurement of long duration storage and clean firm capacity from 2028 to 2031. Next slide, please. Okay, next I will be discussing work that we did on resource adequacy imports. Next slide. So first starting with some historical analysis of how much imports have been contributing over the last few years. So here we pulled data from the CAISO OASIS system looking at 2020 to 2023. And what we're interested when we're thinking about resource adequacy is what was the import megawatts during the periods when the net load was the highest. And so one of the challenges is that there are very few periods when the net load has been above 40,000 megawatts. So we don't have a ton of data points historically here. But you can see looking above that dotted line that we've drawn horizontally on this plot, you can see those points there, and we can run a few statistics using those limited data points, and we can see that nearly all of the top net load hours over 40 gigawatts had imports greater than 5,000 megawatts, and that 90% of those hours had imports greater than 6,000 megawatts. Next slide, please. We also looked specifically at the imports during the 2020 and 2022 heatwave events. These are events, well, 2020 saw rolling blackouts in the CAISO, and September 2022 came quite close. These are also two of the key events that we simulate in the SERVA model when we are simulating loss of load in the CAISO system. And so we pulled some statistics for the minimum and the maximum imports available during those two events. So during 2020, the minimum amount of imports between hours ending 18 to 22 dropped to just over 5,000 megawatts. The maximum about 8,500 megawatts. And then in 2022, the imports were higher, with the lowest being around 7,000 and the highest being almost 10,000. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just ground folks on the way that we, the terminology that we use for imports in Resolve and SERVM on this slide. So we have these categories that Josh was hinting at earlier. There's the specified imports. So these are modeled as specific resources effectively that generate into the CAISO directly, providing firm RA. And then we have what we call unspecified imports. And so these unspecified imports are basically all of the other flows that could occur in our SERVM simulations. And so they include resources that may be contracted by LSEs as specified imports, meaning that they have a resource-backed import contract. They could be contracted as unspecified imports, or they could be not contracted by LSEs, but simply economic imports based on what may be available from the neighbors during peak load events. Next slide, please. So in looking at whether we should alter the current 4 gigawatt unspecified import assumption, we looked at both the historical imports that I showed earlier, including the 2022 and 2020 heat wave events summarized here in this table. We also looked at the resource adequacy supply plans that LSEs have submitted to look specifically at the contracted imports. And so the contracted imports that we saw were roughly between 5 to 6 gigawatts of capacity. And then there was the range that I noted earlier for the heat wave events that varied significantly depending on the hour, but roughly the minimum was about 5 gigawatts. And then our current assumption in Resolve, when we combine the 4 gigawatts unspecified and the 1.9 roughly specified gigawatts of specified imports, we get roughly 6 gigawatts total. So that's important for folks to understand. When we say 4 gigawatts of unspecified imports, the total imports includes the specified imports. So we're really talking about 6 gigawatts of total imports. And we felt that this assumption was broadly consistent with an appropriately conservative view of the historical, actual, and contracted data. And so we're proposing to keep that assumption for this cycle of the 4 gigawatt import limit. And then we would keep in the other hours than the summer net peak, the MIC-based 11.7 gigawatt assumption. Next slide. So in doing our due diligence on this topic, we also performed some SERVM simulations to understand, with the updated loads and resources from updating the baseline for the neighboring regions, how much this was actually impacting system reliability. And in short, what we found was that with these updated neighbor profiles, there wasn't a large impact from imposing this cap on to the CAISO imports. It was quite small from the total impact on system reliability. And you can see from these two graphs why that is. So on the left, we have the simulation within SERVM of the CAISO without the 4 gigawatt cap. So we just have that yellow line, which is 11.7 gigawatts. And what you see is in the hours where we apply the cap, hours 17 to 22, there actually aren't that many imports, even less than 4 gigawatts of imports, even when we don't constrain it. And that tends to rise a little bit later in the evening as the fleet runs out of some of the stored energy on those days with expected unserved energy. And then the graph on the right, we see when we apply that cap, that means that SERVM won't allow more than 4 gigawatts of imports in those hours. So you can see it doesn't impact the imports much, except for hours ending 21 and 22 when they drop a bit. And then based on the amount of storage that is installed in these simulations, we see that the storage fleet can sort of operate around that import constraint. And so the imports do pick back up when we allow them to in hours ending 23 and 24. Next slide. So finally, based on that analysis, we wanted to recognize it may not be realistic to simulate that you're going to get 4 gigawatts of imports in hour ending 22, and then all of a sudden that's going to jump up to 10 or 11 gigawatts of imports in hour ending 23. And so recognizing some of the work that we did and shared as part of the PSP analysis last cycle, looking at this 11 to 4 import cliff versus a more ramped approach, we are proposing here to adopt the more of a ramp approach. And so that would start ramping down from the 11.7 in hour ending 14, applying the 4 gigawatt limit between hours ending 17 and 22, and then ramping back up by the start of the next day to the full MIC capacity. So this enables us to capture what we think is a more realistic import profile. This also ensures that this big drop off between 11 and 4 gigawatts doesn't create some potentially artificial distortions to the storage by creating this big specific hole that the storage can fill. So we think this improves accuracy of modeling imports as well as the accuracy of our storage modeling and ELCC calculations. Okay, so that is it on imports. So now we're moving to the next section of this presentation, which is about some of the inputs that we are still working to develop. The first of those is about geothermal output for candidate resources. Next slide, please. Next slide. So for geothermal power plants, we want to recognize in our modeling approach that there is a variety of types of systems regarding the heat engine cycles used and the cooling technologies used that may impact the ambient D rates that affect geothermal's output at different times of the year. So geothermal plant output can be influenced by both diurnal as well as seasonal shifts in air temperature. And this is going to be more impactful, particularly on air-cooled plants. And we also want to recognize that there may be a lot of geothermal that we are studying in Resolve that is going to be installed in parts of the West where water is very limited. And so therefore, this may be an important factor for us to capture in our modeling, that there may be reduced output during the warm periods of the year in the geothermal plant, and that this is particularly important when we're studying reliability, because those are the same periods of the year when we tend to have the most reliability risk currently. Next slide. So one of the key challenges that we've run into is that there isn't a lot of data out there for new geothermal candidate resource locations as to what level of ambient D rates that they would face. So we were able to find this example from testimony by NV Energy for their application for a new geothermal project in the Southwest. And what you can see here is there is a quite high D rate in the output during the summer, and particularly during the summer late afternoon to early evening hours, up to a 30 to 40% reduction in the output from the plant during those high temperature periods. Next slide, please. So we're considering 3 options in our models to capture this. So the first is a monthly Pmax D rate. So this would reduce the Pmax on a monthly basis to capture some of the seasonal D rates. A month-hour profile for the maximum output from candidate geothermal plants. So this would capture both the seasonal and the diurnal fluctuations in temperature and therefore plant output. And then the third is a temperature-dependent D-rate model. So this would, within CERVM, extend the ambient D-rate model that has been developed for gas plants to geothermal power plants. I will say that each option needs to rely on some sort of historical data or model data for how to represent these candidate geothermal options. We have some CAISO settlement data that could be used for existing units in California, but there are relatively few units that represent the types of cooling systems that we believe may occur in the candidate resources, and therefore that we would use to parameterize this model input. So we are seeking stakeholder input or data on this topic to answer the following questions. Should we provide an additional D-rate to the geothermal during these hot periods? And if so, how should we go about determining the size of that D-rate, and what data can we use and can stakeholders provide to help us inform that input? And with that, I will hand it back to Angana. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. You can go to next slide. This section is about updates related to inter-day sharing for long-duration energy storage. Next slide. I'm going to start with two definitions that are specific to storage, charging, and discharging patterns. Intraday sharing is what we typically use to capture the diurnal storage cycles, particularly to capture energy arbitrage opportunities during a single day. With interday sharing, we are allowing the storage to use a longer duration for charging the storage technology, and also similarly to discharge the stored energy over a longer period of time, and which can be across multiple days. And by long duration energy storage, they can mean 8-hour duration and longer. As this example from CEC long duration energy storage demonstrates, you can see the gray area in May and June, where the state of charge is continuously increasing, meaning that the storage technology, in this case, a 100-hour storage technology, is able to capture excess renewable energy in this period and increase its state of charge and store all that energy over a long period of time. And if you focus on the late August gray area in this figure, you will see the state of charge is continuously going down, meaning that the energy that was stored in the spring, early summertime is now being discharged continuously and over a longer period of time than what an intraday sharing feature daily arbitrage opportunity can capture. So these two definitions are helpful to keep in mind as we go through the specifics of this. Next slide, please. With intra-day sharing, as we have modeled in the past, we use the 23 weather year information, as I explained earlier, and we create our 36 sample representative days. And with intraday sharing, we are basically optimizing each of these sample days independently. And these optimization decisions that decide when the storage resource should charge and discharge are happening independently and only for that same day. So there is no net change in state of charge for that particular day. With interday sharing introduced this cycle, we have the full 23 weather years, the same 36 sample days that are created, but in this case, the sample days are mapped to historical days to create an annual chronology. So by introducing an interday sharing feature, we allow the model, in this case resolve, optimize storage dispatch decisions across multiple sample days and allow for a net change in state of charge to change across sample days. The state of charge constraints, the global constraint that we add to the model, where it allows the storage charging and discharging patterns to track for chronological periods to make sure that it cannot exceed 100% or go below the minimum amounts that we model for each storage technology. These updates to our modeling are ongoing. And can we go to next slide, please? And some of the demonstrations here are going to help to understand what that means in practice and the mechanics of the resolve and how different the interday sharing from intraday and interday sharing, how different they operate practically in our modeling. So at the bottom, you're looking at 4 chronological days, chronological day 1, 2, 3, and 4. Each of these chronological days are associated with one of the sample days at the top row. For example, chronological day 1 represents sample day 1 is associated with chronological day 1, and chronological day 2 is associated with sample day 2. Chronological day 3 is associated with sample day 1 in this example, and chronological day 4 with sample day 3. And this is just an illustrative example to distinguish what happens when we introduce interday sharing. So we'll go through some of the details of this chart. So you can see, if you focus on the chronological day 1 and 2, you see that with intraday sharing, there is discontinuity in state of charge because each day is optimized independently, so there is no continuity of state of charge. Whereas with interday sharing, there is continuity, so the end state of charge and the ending of chronological day 1 is the starting day of the second chronological day. So this way we are able to track the state of charge across multiple periods, multiple chronological periods. And for each of the days that represent specific sample day, you see the dispatch patterns are distinct. For example, if you look at the sample day 1, chronological day 3, sample day 1, chronological day 1, they have similar discharge or state of charge patterns. But what distinguishes these two features is that the beginning and end of the state of charge can be different when we model interday sharing. So if you look at the sample day 3, for example, you see without interday sharing or only with intraday sharing, there is no difference between the beginning of the day and end of day state of charge. But introducing interday sharing, if you look at chronological day 4, for example, that particular day can experience a net loss in state of charge. So these are important as we think about what value the longer duration energy storage or how interday sharing feature can allow capture this seasonality and dispatch patterns that vary from one day to another. Can we go to the next slide, please? While staff is currently performing additional analysis of the implication of interday sharing in Resolve and will evaluate the potential of inclusion of this feature in future modeling work. For the proposed storage technologies that we presented earlier today, staff is seeking some stakeholder feedback on specific parameters that represent storage. For example, minimum state of charge and self-discharge rate can be important parameters to capture the flexibility of these technologies and their operational limitations. So far, we have been modeling or assuming a 0% for pumped hydro storage and 10% minimum state of charge for all other technologies. And for self-discharge rate, which I should be specific here, that is particularly focused to capture energy losses across longer period of time that capture the losses during standby operation beyond what we capture with round-trip efficiencies that typically capture the losses during charging and discharging time of the operation. So the minimum state of charge and self-discharge rate could be important factors, and we seek information if stakeholders can provide us with data sources and suggestions. And especially about self-discharge rate, that data could be limited for some of the novel and emerging technologies, longer duration technologies like 100-hour, and which are also very and highly chemistry dependent. That covers the long duration energy storage and interday sharing updates. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Sangana, and I will wrap up section 8 with proposed changes to the cost to retain CAISO's gas fleet and potential repowering options. Next slide, please. So some background on this proposal, as we mentioned back in section 4, Resolve can optimize whether to economically retain or not retain baseline gas capacity in CAISO, and to do this, it weighs the fixed O&M costs of the gas units against their value towards resource adequacy. So if the fixed O&M cost is higher than the value, Resolve will not retain the gas. If the fixed O&M cost is lower than the reliability value, Resolve will retain the gas on the system. Going back several cycles, we've used costs sourced from a California Energy Commission report for these fixed O&M costs, and they're held constant over the entire modeling horizon. However, in past cycles, stakeholders have raised concerns that these fixed O&M costs are too low, and that there's the potential for these fixed O&M costs to rise over time, and there's also the possibility that gas units will need to repower and incur extra costs to do that at a certain age. And this is the motivation for the updates we're proposing today. Next slide, please. So two key changes that we're proposing. First is that we are proposing that the fixed O&M costs associated with the baseline gas units will increase over time rather than staying static through the whole modeling horizon. Second, we would introduce a candidate resource that would represent a repowering of baseline gas. So it would replace a baseline gas unit on a one-to-one basis and essentially incur an additional cost to repower the unit and gain improved operational attributes such as improved heat rate. And so each year, as Resolve is evaluating the cost of baseline gas, it will have three options in the optimization. First, being to retain the gas and paying increased fixed O&M in future years. Second, to not retain the gas and not pay the cost. And third, to repower the gas. And it's worth noting that, as we mentioned in section 4, combined heat and power units are not subject to Resolve retention or non-retention because they are assumed to be phased out, and likewise they are not eligible for this repowering option either. Next slide, please. So on this slide and next, we're going to go over a diagram showing how Resolve is optimizing the amount of gas in the fleet in the previous cycle, which is this slide, and then our current proposal in the next. So starting on the left, for every baseline gas unit, Resolve first evaluates whether a unit has a scheduled retirement date or not. So that would apply to the combined heat and power units that we phase out over time. And in the past, we've also run sensitivities where we prescribe retirements for gas. And in those cases, the units retire on schedule and Resolve does not optimize them. Anything that doesn't have a set retirement goes into the Resolve optimization, where Resolve looks at its fixed O&M cost, it looks at its value to resource adequacy. And in previous cycles, the two options were to retain the gas and continue paying that static fixed O&M cost, or to not retain the gas. Next slide, please. So in this cycle, the left side of this diagram remains the same, but we have two changes to sort of the right side of the graph. First is that the option to retain the gas as is now comes with increasing fixed O&M costs rather than static. And second, that we now have this new option, which is to repower the unit. And this third option remains the same, which is to not retain the unit and not pay the associated fixed O&M cost. Next slide, please. So as part of this proposal, we are actively seeking comments and input from stakeholders on our proposed inputs, which is first, the repowering age, second, the cost it takes to repower a gas unit, and third, the trajectory for our increasing fixed O&M costs for baseline gas units, and we'll show our current proposed values on the next 3 slides. Next slide, please. So starting with the repowering age, so this would be used to determine when the repowering candidate resource is available in Resolve. We've looked at a large amount of historical data and literature on the ages of gas plants throughout the United States. On the bottom left graph here, we show the age of gas plants when they retired, breaking them up into combined cycles in blue and peakers or combustion turbines in red. And we found that there is a very wide range of retirement ages, generally in the 20 to 60 year range. And similarly, known repowers of thermal units are taking place sort of in the later half of this range. If we look at the bottom right graph, this shows the age of gas plants in the US that are still online. And many of these units are 30, 40, 50 years or older. So the age at which other plants have retired. So similarly, seeing a very large range in both retired and plants that are still online. For our proposal, we are we are planning to use 40 years as the age of repowering. Firstly, because this occurs in the middle of the range of historic retirement dates, which we see on the left graph. And second, this aligns with the age-based retirement date that we have used in past long-term planning modeling in this IRP process. Next slide. When it comes to the cost of repowering units, there is a CapEx or capital cost portion and a fixed O&M portion. For the capital cost portion, we are assuming the cost of a new brownfield gas unit. So this is meant to isolate the cost of equipment, essentially of building a new turbine, and excludes site acquisition costs, since this would be a repower of a unit on an existing site. So for combined cycle repowers, this would be about 90% of the greenfield costs, or the cost of a fully new unit, coming in at about $95 per kilowatt year. And for repowered peakers or combustion turbines, this would be about 86% of the greenfield costs, coming in around $114 per kilowatt year. And for fixed O&M, we would assume that they use the same fixed O&M as fully new build candidate gas plants at about $32 and $36 per kilowatt year, respectively. Next slide, please. And lastly, looking at the trajectory for the increasing fixed O&M costs of the baseline non-repowered units. In this case, staff have not found much robust data or trends, and this includes data on gas plants specific to California. So tentatively, we are recommending an increasing fixed O&M on a linear schedule of a 1% increase per year, starting at a certain age, such as 40 years, to align with the date repowering becomes available. But like the previous two proposals, we are seeking input from stakeholders as we finalize this. And with that, I'll pass it to Jared to go over next steps for after the conclusion of this workshop.
All right. Thanks, Josh. Next slide, please. And then go ahead to the next slide. So just circling back to the front, to the start of the workshop, noting we are looking to receive informal written feedback and comments to these draft INAs. And just a quick reminder, they're informal, so they're not a part of the proceeding record. They're to inform staff on how best to update these inputs and assumptions. And we would like the comments by March 7th. I've noted here again, it's the email address to send them to, and also encourage the commenters to share the comments with the service list as well. Additionally, again, to please categorize your comments so staff are better able to review them and incorporate them if appropriate. And then sort of, I guess, with our timing here, I think we can actually open it up a little bit to some verbal questions. I know our staff are working to finish answering the Q&A questions, so I'm hoping to give them a little time to do that as well as we do this. But again, for these verbal questions, it's important. My request is to focus on clarifying and understanding questions, and to really save the comments and advocacy of changes, additions to the inputs and assumptions for the written comments. We really want to know what you all recommend and suggest, and would like that in the written comments, so you can also provide the supporting details and data corresponding to that. So with that, I guess we can pause here to see if anyone has a question they want to raise verbally. And then Alex, I see Nick So Alex can go ahead and unmute Nick with a little right click. One second.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Nick Pappas for ACP California. Really appreciate what a massive body of work this is in each cycle, and the flurry of information both here and also happening in the Q&A. I just wanted to ask if it would be possible to have a longer workshop session like this to go into some of the areas where there are some complexity, nuance, or subjectivity. Obviously not here today, but I'll just benchmark this. I was double booked today on a call held by Pacificor, which is going through the same IRP INA assumptions, and they do a series of 2-day meetings throughout the year to go through arguably much less information than you guys have. So I want to just note how awesome this work is and just ask if there's an opportunity to set up a time and a process to go into a little bit greater depth for folks to both understand it and provide substantive feedback.
Jared, I could try to provide some thoughts. Thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
The spirit of what you're getting at is being echoed in one or two other questions in the Q&A today. And we're doing our darndest to do a balance between timelines, which, you know, a lot of the people on the call are familiar with. We're always trying to cram a lot into each IRP cycle. And your ability to take on this information and digest. That's, you know, why we posted this a week ago. We know that, you know, another week from now is probably pretty tight for those of you that really want to dig into this information. But in order to keep our timelines, what we need is that information within a week. What I can say is we won't close the door on consideration of information that comes in after that, but it's very possible that if we get information after that, we can't get it into the next deliverables, which I think Jared and the team described as filing requirements and other things that need to start happening within weeks, not months. So similar to that, I see a question, I think it's from Stephen Torres at Edison, but speaking maybe on behalf of the joint IRUs for more time, I'd provide the same answer there. We know that you're trying to do your best to dig into this information and provide you know, the best response that you can in order to sharpen this information into the best thing that it possibly can be. But in order to keep timelines, we need this within a week. But again, we could take info after a week from now. We just can't guarantee that it would make it into the next deliverable. And I guess to give an idea of potential real world impacts, that 1 week from now deadline is so that we can still get the filing requirements out on time so that all the LSCs can then have time to produce their IRPs and submit them at the deadline that we specified in Q4.
Thanks, Nathan.
So actually, Nick, you still had a more narrow question in there that I didn't answer could we have more workshop type interaction on some of these topics? I think that's something that maybe after we digest what comes back in comments, we can make a call on. And for those of you that have really strong feelings about, hey, we need to focus on something in a workshop type environment or just some further conversation or subsequent to this, please make that very clear in your comments. We know that a lot of folks might take that as an opportunity to dump everything that they care about into that bucket of we care a lot, this needs to be workshop more. Please know that we'll be on the lookout for that sort of thing. We value all of your input, but we know that there still is a prioritization of things and not everything is going to reach that level. So I hope that helps, but we are doing our best to keep timelines here, recognizing that those timelines affect a lot of other people in the room too.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. That's exactly what I was going to say. Was if you do feel very strongly about certain issues, needing additional group discussion and maybe not adequately addressable in the comments, please do note that in the comments. And then, okay, I don't see any other hands raised. So I think with that, I'll note for the Q&As that staff will be finishing answering the Q&As and will be posting the fully answered Q&As on our website as soon as possible within the next day or two, essentially work day or two. So I think with that, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. I'd like to thank all our presenters for this over 3-hour workshop covering a wide range of inputs and assumptions. So thanks everyone and have a good afternoon. And with that, I think you can stop the recording.